Alrighty then. Looks like we are recording. I already did the sound test. The microphone is working now. By the time I get to the end of this, if the microphone is still working or not, I can't say. I am Panyo Basa. This is... Oh, I forgot. I got hair in my mouth. I forgot. Welcome to question and answer number 153. And also the second half of question and answer number 152, because those of you who didn't watch the first half of 152 may not have noticed that the microphone died halfway through, which it turns out was due to a loose connection, which is now tightened. This is my beverage. And I am your host, Panyo Basa. And I'm starting kind of late again, especially considering this may be the longest Lulu of a question and answer that I have done thus far. This could be a record breaker because, as I've already intimated, this is 1.5 Q&As. This is all of 153. 153, not a prime number. It's, let's see here, it's 3 times 51. And then 51 is also 3 times, let's see, 3 times 1, 17. So it's 3 times 3 times 17. If I did my math correctly. So, I did a Q&A last week, another late one, a nocturnal one, and the microphone died. So I've got to do the second half over again, which... It's just my karma, I think. I mean, some of you who've been watching these for a few years may recall that I was using a different video processing software at first, and it just stopped working after a while. I'd be doing a Q&A, and I'd get to the end and find out that the whole thing had not recorded at all. One time, one really horrible time, I had to do the same Q&A 3 times. But the show must go on. And so, I sit before you in my 100% natural fiber, custom-made Lithuanian linen robe. And I'm going to commence answering questions, because I'm going to have to kind of be a little more concise than usual, maybe, just to keep this less than like 4.5 hours. So, the first question is from Phil Lathes, and Phil Lathes asked the transgressive 4th question in the last Q&A, causing his name to go on a list. But now he's asked 3 more, so now we're up to 7. But the thing is, some people are going to be mentioned twice. So if your questions aren't answered the first time, bear with me, because I've added the later questions below the second half of the first list of questions. So some people are going to be mentioned twice. And those of you who like to hear your name mentioned, it's just going to be just that much more gratification. So, this first question may have been rhetorical, but there is actually a question mark in it. And so, I'm just going to go ahead. This is in response to some statements I made in question and answer number 151, which was a prime number. 151 still is a prime number, in fact. Regarding James and St. Paul and certain struggles for whatever. So this is Phil Lathes asks, did James really get outcompeted by Paul? ? How do we know this? That's incredible. Well, my understanding of this sort of competition between James, who wanted things to stay Jewish, and I mean, he knew Jesus way better than Paul did, because allegedly he was Jesus's brother, James, who became the leader of the church in Jerusalem after Jesus was crucified. St. Paul, on the other hand, was like the apostle to the Gentiles, who was sort of anti-Judaism. He wanted to make a break with Judaism, no more Mosaic law, that kind of stuff. No more circumcision, which probably was causing a lot of prospective Christians to balk at the idea. You know, it's like, you can join our religion, but first we got to cut off the end of your pee-pee. A lot of people didn't like that in those days. You know, it's like, okay, well, I'll just kind of be interested in Christianity, but not really commit because I don't want the end of my pee-pee cut off. That kind of thing. But mainly what I know about this competition between James and Paul, and how James pretty much got edited out of the New Testament. There are very few mentions of him, despite the fact that he was A, Jesus' brother, and B, essentially the leader of Christianity after Jesus died. So most of what I know about this, I learned from a man whose last name is Tabor. I think, is it James Tabor? He's the author of the Tabor blog. He has contributed to a lot of like biblical archaeology kind of newsletters and magazines, that kind of stuff. And he's got a YouTube channel, and he's got long, exhaustive videos discussing this very subject. So if you really want to know like about how Paul and James were sort of competing for dominance in the new Christian church, because it was new at that time, then I would recommend that you watch Tabor's, Tabor, his videos, or read his blog, his articles. I'm sure you could look it up fairly easily. But James, I mean, I've also read in a Bible commentary, not from Tabor, that the general epistle of James, which is almost the only press James gets in the New Testament, was a kind of rebuttal of Paul. You know, faith without works is dead. Whereas Paul was saying it's faith that's going to get you into heaven. So, it's one thing that I learned from Tabor, from learning about this whole, you know, James the Just stuff, is that probably Jesus did consider himself to be the Messiah and also a descendant of King David. And so the early Christians had to have someone, a branch of David, as the leader of the Christian church. And so it was a family thing within Jesus's family. After James was martyred, then I think there was a cousin named Simon who became like leader of the church in Jerusalem. So let's see. Yeah, the Paul faction won out. You know, it was sort of converted Gentiles became, you know, the overwhelming majority of Christians. The Jewish Christians, you know, the Christians who remained Jewish, became a smaller and smaller minority, and then they were persecuted. For example, they weren't allowed to live in Jerusalem. I think it was the emperor, not Trajan, Hadrian. Hadrian tried to set up Jerusalem as a pagan city, and Jews were not even allowed to live there. They might have entered surreptitiously from time to time. So just Paul's side of the controversy, you know, the competition won out. You know, the Ebionites eventually went extinct, you know, the Jewish Christians. Still, you got Jews for Jesus, but it's not really mainstream Christianity anymore. But again, if you want to know about this whole sort of rivalry between Paul and James kind of losing and getting almost edited out of the New Testament, despite his importance, then yeah, I would consult with, I think it's James Tabor, but I'm not sure about the first name. Tabor, Tabor. And I'm just going to move on to Phil Lathy's second question. And Phil Lathy's asked some extremely long questions. I asked him to try to be more concise, and so we're getting like the Reader's Digest version of the first time he asked the questions. He asked them again in shorter terms. So the second question, he's asking if Pure Land can be said to be a cataphatic or positivist version of something like Zen, which is more non-dualistic and is describing Nibbana in positive terms. And I really don't think so. In a lot of Zen Buddhism, maybe most Zen Buddhism nowadays, has Pure Land elements added. I went to a Zen monastery in California once, and I was surprised to see all the Pure Land stuff. There was even some Pure Land kind of chanting going on, like in the Dharma hall. You know, the monks and nuns would get together and they'd be chanting about Amitabha, this kind of thing. So, even so, I do think that it was two very different schools of Buddhism that were like the two main schools of Buddhism in like medieval Japan that just sort of got conflated. They got kind of added together. And yeah, I do not think that Pure Land could really be said to be sort of a, well, like an exoteric, is that a word? Exoteric version of Zen or anything like that. Zen is just meditation, stay away from dogmas as much as you can, pretty much. Not always in practice, but that's, you know, sort of a theme of Zen Buddhism. You know, don't be dogmatic, that kind of thing. Whereas Pure Land Buddhism is, I mean, it relies heavily on mythology. You know, it's just like invented whole new Buddhas out of who knows what. So, yeah, I really don't think so. And I'm just going to move on to Philalethes' third question here. He says, he wants to know if you can say Pure Land is rooted in the Pali Canon, as in the Madhyamaka Sutta, where the Buddha says reciting the Buddha name is the first method to mental purification, uprooting unwholesomeness after cultivating the 5 strengths. And I haven't read the Madhyamaka Sutta lately, but in the long version of this question, he was pointing out that the Madhyamaka Sutta isn't saying just reciting the Buddha name is the first mention. It's one of the meditations of Orthodox Theravada is recollection of the virtues of the Buddha. And it starts off EDP so bhagawa arham samasa buddha, and you know, and just continues. It's sort of like this formula. You know, recollection of the virtues of the Buddha, recollection of the virtues of the Dhamma, recollection of the virtues of the Sangha, recollection of your own past meritorious deeds, recollection of the Devas. You know, those are 5 kind of recollection meditation techniques that are mainstream Orthodox Theravada. And so it's not really using the Buddha name, not Gautama or Siddhartha, anything like that. It's just a recollection of the Buddha's qualities or virtues, which then at some point got crystallized into this formula that gets recited almost like a mantra. And in Burma, for example, that's one of the main kinds of meditation that lay people do. They use a mala, like a Buddhist rosary, and it's like you go through the 9 qualities of the Buddha, which is the first 9 in the 969, which has a movement named after it. The 9 qualities of the Buddha, and then 1 bead, and then maybe you'll switch to the 6 qualities of the Dhamma, or just keep doing the 9 qualities of the Buddha, and it's a bead for each time. But it's not using the name of the Buddha as a kind of meditation technique. The Thai forest tradition has adopted Buddho or Bhutto as a kind of mantra that is very, very common in Thailand. I never heard of it happening in Burma, but it wouldn't surprise me. You know, some people at least who have been influenced by the Thai forest tradition who are living in Burma may use that. But it's not the same as just reciting the Buddha's name or just Buddha in the hopes of being reborn in some kind of heaven realm, which according to Pure Land Buddhism isn't even in samsara, which is very strange. It's kind of playing hob with Orthodox Buddhist philosophy right there. And I got to be careful that I don't accidentally loosen the cord on this microphone. But it seems to be working, so let's just continue here. I don't think that Pure Land is rooted in the Pali Canon. It's like at some point people were trying to practice Buddhism as found in the ancient texts, so-called Hinayana, or more politely, Shravakayana texts, the pre-Mahayana texts. And most of them, like most people nowadays, just couldn't get enlightened. You know, they just weren't ripe for it yet or whatever. And then they would just say, well, this is the Kali Yuga. You can't get enlightened anymore. So we're just going to pray to some cosmic being to help us at least get reborn into a situation where it's easier to get enlightened. And yeah, I do not think the Buddha would have endorsed that at all. I mean, you do what you can to become enlightened in this life, and most people fail. Sorry to say, the overwhelming majority of people fail, even the people who are just diligently striving, wholeheartedly. Even most of them fail. And partly it's just they're not ripe yet. They've still got all these latent tendencies, blind spots, and so forth. So, I mean, even people who can just sit like a statue for 3 hours straight, still, most of them, you know, they still got these quirks and biases and attachments and so forth that it's hard to deal with, especially if you're practicing on your own or you're practicing with an unenlightened teacher. Then if you're practicing on your own, you don't see your own blind spots. You can just drift off into eccentricity if you're not getting feedback. And the best feedback, of course, would be from an enlightened teacher. So people that don't have access to that have like a major handicap in their practice. So I think I'm just going to move on to Phil Lathy's fourth transgressive question, which is with regard to Amitabha's 35th vow. And in the first version of this question, he was like, what do you think about Amitabha's 35th vow? And I have no clue. I don't even know what Amitabha's first vow is. I just never had. Once I learned what Pure Land was about, I just lost all interest. Because it fairly clearly, fairly obviously does not represent what the earliest Buddhism was teaching. So anyways, here's what Phil Lathes is asking. He wants to know, Amitabha's 35th vow is his highly controversial statement that women who are good Pure Land Buddhists will be reborn as men. Whether in this life or the next, or whether metaphorically or literally is unclear, but I have noticed this short line is fuel for immense mental gymnastics among Westerners since you have such a statement from a supposedly enlightened being. So he wants to know what I think about Amitabha's 35th vow, even though there's no question mark in this abbreviated version of the question. And I mean, if you're a good Pure Land Buddhist, then presumably you're going to be reborn into the Pure Land of the West or a Pure Land somewhere. And technically it's not in samsara, but then how are you going to be reborn as male or female in such like a paradoxical realm that isn't even in samsara? I mean, if it's not in samsara, there's not going to be any kind of discernible qualities. So, I mean, it's this kind of really bad logic in Mahayana Buddhism in general, in some schools of it, and in Pure Land in particular, that I just don't understand. So, anyways, it is common in like Asian Buddhism, traditional Asian Buddhism, and traditional Asian culture. It is traditional to assume, as it was in the West up until modern times, it's preferable to be a man than to be a woman. Even like postmodern feminists are trying to be like men without really admitting that they want to be men or like men, but still they're trying to be like men. A lot of them are. So anyways, like traditional Asian Buddhism, for example, there are a lot of what are called votive tablets. Like when they dig up like a medieval Buddhist temple in Asia, they'll find lots and lots of these votive tablets that are inscribed, maybe like they're scratched into clay or something like that. It's somebody makes this inscription, this little inscription, they'll donate to the temple and they'll set up this memorializing this vow that they've made or some such. And a lot of these votive tablets that are dug up in places like Burma are women like they're praying to be reborn as a man in their next life because they consider that to be an improvement over their lot, which, I mean, socially speaking, in medieval Asia, probably was pretty right on there. So it was apparently a belief back when Amitabha was making his 35th vow that it's better to be a man than a woman, that it's like a step upwards on the evolutionary scale somehow. And so it was just kind of built into the Pure Land Amitabha vows. And I have no clue whatsoever what any of the other vows are. The 35th one is the only one I know about just because Philalethes explained it to me. So let's see here. Yeah, the mental gymnastics are, that's not surprising at all. I mean, modern Western, especially liberal kind of Buddhists, just don't want to accept, like a lot of Theravada Buddhism too. They just really have trouble with that. And so they will have to go through mental gymnastics. They'll just say, well, the Buddha didn't really teach that part. That must have been added later because it's so politically incorrect by postmodern Western standards. So I guess I better move on to the next question because I really do have to kind of be concise to keep this thing less than 5 hours. This is from Cleefy. And Cleefy says, could you make a video about 3 aspects of existence: impermanence, uneasiness, and no self? And I probably already have. Maybe one of my videos with Brian, but also one of the first philosophical essays I wrote as a monk was on the 3 marks of existence. And I don't look at my own website. It's like my sweetheart has set it up for me. She's put everything on it. And so I don't even know if that essay is on there. It used to be on the older nipapancha.org website. It was one of the philosophical essays that you could read on that website, the 3 marks of existence. And one of the main things of interest to me, mainly I was defining the key terms. Sabe, we got that. That just means all. And sankhara is conditioned things, anicca, impermanence. Dukkha is, unease. Anatta, no self. Although some people will quibble whether it means no self or non-self, that kind of thing. And the fan is on. It's kind of sweltery here in summertime South Carolina lately. Thunderstorms almost every day lately. And also Dhamma, Sabe Dhamma Anatta. So one of the interesting points I discuss in the essay is why is it Sabe Sankhara? All sankharas are impermanent, all sankharas are unease or conducive to unease, but all dhammas, not sankharas, but dhammas, are without self. And the reason it seems most obvious to me is that Sabe Sankhara is referring to samsara, the samsaric phenomena, but Sabe Dhamma is referring to anything, including Nibbana itself. There's no self, according to the formula of the 3 marks. Not even the ultimate reality or conventional reality, neither samsara nor Nibbana, nothing. But if you can't find that, maybe you can get back to me. Like if it's not on the website, then it should get put up there. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Superlump. And Superlump says, how do monks in Burma and America deal with health insurance and medical bills? Well, if you protect Dhamma, Dhamma protects you. And I don't know, I'm sure that there are monks in the West who have health insurance. But in Burma, there's not much health insurance in Burma. But for monks, like in my case, there'd be devout Buddhist doctors who would just say, if you have any health problems, just let me know and I'll help you. With regard to something minor, you've got a fever, an infection, something like that, they can help you with that. I mean, if you've got something really serious, then you're pretty much screwed. You know, you can take some kind of herbal stuff, and if you get better, that's fine. If you don't get better, well, may you have a good rebirth if you have to be reborn. And I remember in the previous Q&A, the half that didn't get recorded, I was mentioning how the way my karma worked was sort of as follows. That, I mean, I've told this story before, but when I was living in this remote forest monastery, I would continually be biting into rocks in my food, mainly because rice and beans are threshed on the ground. So little white rocks get mixed in with the rice, little brown rocks get mixed in with the beans. And so I'd be eating, and all of a sudden, crack, you know, just this, it hurts. And there's like this audible cracking sound, and I'd be like feeling around in my mouth to see if I broke a tooth or knocked a filling out or something, and it would hurt. And I'm thinking, man, if I break teeth, you know, if I break my teeth biting into a rock out here in the middle of nowhere, what am I going to do? But as it turned out, living out in the middle of nowhere, I didn't break a tooth. I didn't even knock out a filling. But then I happened to be staying in a relatively wealthy area of Rangoon. There was a supporter of the Tongpulu tradition that had this empty building on his property where Tongpulu monks could stay for free. You know, when they got business in Rangoon, they can just stay there. So that's what I did. And so I'm going for alms round in this relatively wealthy neighborhood of Rangoon. This servant girl gives me some bean curry with a rock in it. And I bite into that bean curry and break 3 teeth. And it's like, it like was right in between, you know, you got 2 teeth coming up down this way and 2 teeth here. It was like right in between there, and it broke 3 of them all at the same time. But as it turned out, that servant girl was the servant girl of the dean and rector of the Rangoon Dental College. He was the #1 dentist in the entire country. And so he just said, well, come on over and it was just almost right across the street. Just come over, I'll fix your teeth for free. He had like a little dental clinic inside his house. Fixed my teeth for free, and he said, anytime you need any kind of dental work, just come to me and I'll take care of it. So for a while, I had the same dentist as the dictator. But yeah, in America, I don't know. It's like, if you're a monk, I mean, how did monks in the Buddhist time deal with this stuff? You know, it's like, they're not going to be going to hospitals and having like $10,000 tests done on themselves, that kind of thing. It's like, take care of Dhamma. Dhamma takes care of you. You live a clean life. You're less likely to have health problems. You live a moral life, and you're more likely to have good karma, less bad things happen to you. So, I notice I say so a lot. It's just kind of a filler, I think, some of the time. Yeah, I mean, having like a chronic health condition as a monk is kind of, it can be somewhat problematic. But as a general rule, in Buddhist Asia, the people are very devout, and some of the doctors are devout Buddhists who are quite willing to help monks. And also, there are Sangha hospitals in Burma. So monks can go to the Sangha hospitals that are, I mean, a lot of them were started by a certain Sayadaw, who may as well remain nameless, who just is a very rich man and has collected lots of money. And some of that money has been used to build hospitals for the Sangha. So that's another option for sick monks in Burma. But as a general rule, a sick monk in Burma, you just have other monks or novices or maybe family members looking after you and treating you as well as they can, at least keeping you relatively comfortable. You know, keeping you clean if you're lying in bed, soiling yourself, that kind of thing. And nature takes its course, and that's the way people have lived for almost the entirety of our existence on this planet. So insurance and medical bills are seen as some kind of necessity nowadays, but really they're not. And I guess I'm just going to move on to this question. Also from Superlump, who says, did being a monk for 30 years doom you to never being able to retire? I'm planning on retiring around the age of 72. So that's like 10 more years of laboring as one of the proletariat. After 30 years in the leisure class, I decided to come back and become a manual laborer. So I've got it set up like my 401k, and by the time I'm 72, I should almost certainly have enough hours in to collect Social Security. I mean, it won't be like top tier Social Security, but it'll be enough to live on, I'm pretty sure. I mean, lately, I've got 15% of my income going into the 401k. So long as the economy doesn't completely crash, I should be able to support myself and my woman without too much hardship. I don't think we're going to be living under a bridge, panhandling, anything like that. So I guess I answered that. I'm going to move on to Superlump's third question. Do you have any stories about the Pali examinations in Burma? And like I told you last time, and you didn't hear it because the microphone didn't work, I did spend 1 year at Mahagandayon, which is in a suburb, pretty much a suburb of Mandalay. It's in the city of Amarapura, the deathless city, which used to be for a short time the capital of Burma. And Mahagandayon is a school monastery, so almost all the monks there are students or teachers. You know, they're studying or teaching for the Pali examinations so that you can get like this title, you know, like the Dhammasariya degree, which is sort of like a bachelor's degree in Buddhist studies, and it's prestigious. Then there's the Dhammakattika degree, which is sort of like a master's degree in Buddhism. And then there's like special honorific titles. Like some of you may have heard of, for example, a Burmese monk whose name ends in Biwamtha. I think that, I can't remember his name now. There's two relatively famous monks with the same name that end in Biwamtha. One was the founder of Mahagandayon, the school monastery I attended for a year. And if you get this Biwamtha degree, or you get that Biwamtha added to your name, that means that it was like you had to score really high on this special test in order to get that degree. So it means that you're a brilliant scholar, essentially. But anyways, getting to the story of the Pali examinations in Burma, here I'm digressing all the time when I've got 1.5 Q&As to do. The year that I spent at Mahagandayon, nationwide, there was this announcement from the government that everybody failed their Pali tests, their tests in Dhamma, like Pali examinations, because there was so much cheating going on. They couldn't sort out who did it honestly and who cheated. It's like a copy of the test paper, somebody got their hands on it and started distributing it. So there was lots of monks who were reading the test questions in advance, knew what the test questions were going to be. And because of this, so many monks cheating on the test, they just threw out the results and said, nobody passes this year. And it's not the only year that happened. But one thing about like a school monastery, like finals week at a school monastery in Burma is very different from finals week at like a university in the West. At a university in the West, finals week, it's like silent. You know, it's like everybody is studying. Whereas in Burma, finals week, you know, right leading up to the examinations, it is just ear splitting because you've got all these people that are just reciting out loud these answers to, you know, questions that might appear on the test. You know, it's like the way it works is rote memorization. And so you've got these people just, sometimes they're practically shouting, just rapid fire, just memorizing it, just like building grooves in their brain for these answers that might get asked on the test, or for sure will get asked on the test if they're cheating and saw the test in advance. So it's very weird. Like the Burmese educational system is mainly based traditionally on rote memorization. And so you don't even really have to understand the answer to the test question so long as you can just parrot the correct answer. And I do think that's changing a little bit. There's more sort of Western ideas coming into Burma with regard to education. I had a few Buddhist teachers, like monk teachers, asking me, how could we improve this? Because really just memorizing, the answer to a question and without even having to understand it is not the best way of learning. Although I have to admit, there are some phenomenal scholars, just totally phenomenal Buddhist scholars in Burma. So, I suppose I could tell stories about that, but I got to keep going here. So the next question is from Rui. Rui says, hello, Panya, do you think state of flux and impermanence are the same thing? Where in the scriptures would one find the expression state of flux? So that's the second question there. Barring the contemporary Buddhist scientist explanation that says the cup on the table is made of flowing particles, something which is inaccessible to experience, what would be the soteriological value of state of flux? So this is actually 3 questions, so I might as well separate them. So we're above 60 questions this time. This is probably the largest number of questions ever on a Q&A because reasons. So first question, do you think state of flux and impermanence are the same thing? Well, they're not necessarily the same thing. That state of flux would be a kind of impermanence, but impermanence is not necessarily state of flux. It's like a frog's an amphibian, but frogs and amphibians are not necessarily the same thing because you got salamanders, for example. So, a state of flux would be just like continuous change. Whereas impermanence, that's, it's like anything that has a beginning has an end. So if you're born, you're going to die. That kind of thing, that's not necessarily state of flux. But if you get into Buddhist philosophy, especially Abhidhamma, then everything is blinking off and on at 1 trillion times a second. Matter is blinking off and on at like 1 trillion times per eye blink, and mind is flashing off and on like 17 trillion times per eye blink. Mind goes way faster than matter does with regard to its state of flux. And just philosophically, just setting aside Buddhism really, that there has to be something changing every moment. Otherwise, you're dead that moment. That you're not even going to notice the passage of time. If everything stays the same 2 moments in a row, you're just going to know, you're going to be aware of 1 moment at most. There always has to be something changing, and it creates a kind of dependent co-arising of there has to be like a kind of balance between change and stasis. Because if everything is changing like every moment, that's just like primordial chaos. It's like you don't have anything remaining the same at all, then nobody is going to have a memory, anything like that. It's just going to be just like static on an old TV screen. Whereas if everything remains the same, or like if nothing stays the same, then it's chaos. But if nothing changes, it's death. So you got to have like the middle path between chaos and death, which involves some things changing and some things at least apparently staying the same, at least remaining within the same theme. Sort of like, these tweezers, for example. Well, you can say that they're the molecules or the atoms composing these tweezers are arising and passing away. This whole thing of tweezers here is blinking off and on at 1 trillion times a second, according to Theravada, but at least it's staying the same within the realm of, what kind of atoms in the same positions and everything, more or less. So there's that kind of stasis that has to be involved in the equation, because just total change of everything at all times would just be like staticky chaos. But if nothing changes, then that's death. So I'm just going to move on to Rui's second question here. Where in the scriptures would one find the expression state of flux? And I mean, nowhere, because the scriptures are in Pali. And what the Pali equivalent of state of flux would be, I really can't say offhand. But it could be that some Pali term could be reasonably translated as state of flux. But really, the state of flux, that everything is flashing off and on 1 trillion times per eye blink, is mainly found in Abhidhamma and the commentarial literature. So it might not say in like that term, state of flux, but still the idea that everything is just blinking off and on 1 trillion times a second, approximately, that is just integral to the orthodox Theravada Buddhist explanation of samsaric reality. That Nibbana itself isn't flashing off and on, but everything in samsara is. So the term itself may not be found in the texts, but the process is there. So I'm just going to move on to Rui's third question. Barring the contemporary Buddhist scientist explanation that says the cup on the table is made of flowing particles, something which is inaccessible to experience, what would be the soteriological value of state of flux? Soteriological means like with regard to salvation, it's like, how is it going to help you to become enlightened by being aware of the state of flux? Well, I mean, from the Buddhist point of view, just believing in this, everything is flashing off and on. From the Theravada Buddhist point of view, I mean, that's just understanding reality. So that's going to help you become enlightened because you are penetrating through the illusion and seeing things as they really are. But then again, the Sarvastivada Buddhists didn't believe that everything's flashing off and on. They would say that any combination of these atoms, these dharmas, is impermanent, but the dharmas themselves are like eternal. So that's a different school of Buddhism, very closely related to Theravada, that really didn't have this state of flux idea, except still something has to change constantly just for us not to be dead for that moment. So let's see here. Something which is what would be the soteriological value of state of flux? If it's just a theory, then there's really no liberating value, other than it might weaken your attachment to like normie samsara. Just being philosophical and questioning the reality of everything around you, that kind of thing, which is kind of what philosophy does. That can kind of loosen your grip on your own unenlightened version of samsara. But I think from an orthodox Theravada Buddhist point of view, the main value of believing in the state of flux is that it'll help you to see the reality of the state of flux. But not all schools of Buddhism believe in this state of flux, at least not with regard to all the particles flashing off and on, blinking off and on. So I guess I'll just move on to this question. This is from PSA. And PSA says, I was having a massive panic attack and extreme anxiety because your video, which was like 151, dropped a few hours late this week. What should I do about my Panyobasa addiction? That's note it. Note it, let it go. Note it, let it go. Whenever it arises, note it and let it go. That's questions like that are really easy. You just adopt the Mahasi method. It's like what a Mahasi meditation instructor would tell you at a retreat. What should I do about this? Note it, let it go. Note it. Be aware of it. Observe it like an ichthyologist observes a dead fish. So I'm just going to move on to PSA's next question. When you were a child, did you dream of growing up to become this wiggling, bearded Viking marauder? No, I've never really had much like intuitive affinity with like Germanic paganism or ancient Germanic tribes. Like if I were a pagan, I'd have to be like a Neoplatonist. I'd go more like classical Greco-Roman. That I'm just much more interested in like ancient Greco-Roman religion, especially Roman, I guess, rather than, Thor and Odin and that sort of thing. So, no, I had no idea that I would ever even grow a beard. That for a lot of my life, I just had this idea I could not grow a good beard, so I didn't even try. And then finally, in my late 50s, or maybe even 60, I tried to grow a beard and whoa, hey, it works. And then I had this idea of a bearded, like a braided beard. Or like there's this guy on YouTube, he does like heavy metal covers of non-heavy metal songs. His name is Leo Moriccioli. He's just got this long beard and it's not really braided. He's just got rubber bands going all the way down the length of it at intervals of about an inch or so, which looks pretty cool. I just think it looks cool. So let's see here. So the idea is I'm going to grow my beard long enough that I can have like a Mjolnir bead at the bottom of it and keep it that way a little while and then probably just cut it back off again. So let's see here. It is true though that I have like Northern Germanic ancestry. In fact, most of my ancestry is Northern Germanic, apparently. But if I'm like I take more of an intuitive interest in what apparently was my past lives rather than my like materialistic ancestry, empirical ancestry. So I think I probably was like Roman more than I was like Germanic. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this was the reason why the Shwedagon Pagoda was on the previous Q&A's thumbnail, because my sweetheart made the thumbnail before I realized that the second half of the video didn't work. That I was just sitting here. Yeah, I just tricked you just now because I really wasn't talking just then. But yeah, I have been to the Shwedagon Pagoda several times, and it's well worth going to. It's this huge gold-plated pagoda with just encrusted with jewels way up high where you can't really see it. Although there are like little viewing telescopes that you can look through in the what's the word? The area, the walking area all around the pagoda. There's all kinds of interesting things there. There's smaller pagodas. There's like museums, that kind of thing, all on the platform around the Shwedagon. And most people don't know this, but there is a higher platform on the Shwedagon where men could go up and look around, including I've been up there before, but women are not allowed. And because so many Western women were making scenes, like trying to sneak up there just to prove a point, that kind of thing, that the government finally just banned all foreigners from going up on the higher platform. Just part of that idea that men are superior to women in Asia. Traditional Buddhist Asia, probably traditional non-Buddhist Asia also. Like Islam, for example. So yeah, the Shwedagon is well worth seeing. It's not my favorite like religious place to go to in Burma. My favorite religious place to go to in Burma would be Po Windown, which is in northwestern Burma, not too far from the city of Monua. And it's a cave complex. It's over 1,000 caves, I'm pretty sure. They're like dug into this sandstone mountain with Buddha images and so forth inside. It's all medieval. There's a few murals still existing in these caves representing Mongols and so forth. So probably it happened back when Burma was, after Burma had been conquered by one of Kublai Khan's generals. But my favorite thing is not so much the caves or the Buddha images or the murals. It's the troops of scroungy monkeys, because I just love feeding monkeys. Whenever I'd go, I'd bring like this grocery sack of just monkey food, little bananas and little oranges and jujubes and stuff like that monkeys like. I just love feeding monkeys for some reason. It's like they're my brothers. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Mooners, and we're still doing the second half of 152 at this point. Mooners says, suppose that a Buddhist were to be asked by a Christian, why do you worship an idol? Would it be in poor taste for the Buddhist to reply back with, why do you worship a dead Jew on a stick? And yeah, that'd be in poor taste. I think that's fairly obvious. Maybe Mooners just asked the question as a kind of joke. Also, I mean, it could be considered parusa vacha, or abusive speech. If you're saying it deliberately to insult the Christian, to make him feel bad or make her feel bad, or zur or whatever, that, I mean, if you say that just to be nasty, then not only would it be poor taste, but it'd also be bad ethics. You'd be violating a precept of wrong speech. So, but with regard to myself, I don't really worship idols. I have the little Buddha statue up there on top of the bookcase, closest thing I've got to an altar. I have bowed to that sometimes, especially in times of crisis or something. It's just sort of like focusing on me bowing to, whatever enlightened beings and saints are out there that might be aware of my presence, really. I'm not bowing to a little statue, really. I mean, it's just sort of like a focus, a convenient direction to be bowing. But I know that little statue up there is just a little hunk of marble, which probably doesn't look very much like the actual historical Gautama Buddha. And most of my time in Burma, I mean, the Burmese are very devout, kind of medieval in their approach to religion. And like at the beginning of the Uposatha ceremony, all the Sangha would convene in the congregation hall. They'd always start off bowing to the image on the altar, and I would just sit there and not bow most of the time. Most of the time I would not bow. And then sometimes a Burmese monk would say, well, you get kudo, you get merit for bowing to the statue or bowing to the Buddha. And I'm saying, well, I mean, that statue has no sila, no samadhi, and no panya. Has no virtue, has no concentration, and it has no wisdom. It's just an image. It's rupa. So let's see here. I guess I'll just move on to this question. This is from Arpad. And Arpad says, is having a home shrine really useful in Buddhism? Doesn't it lead to attachment to rites and rituals? A home shrine, I mean, it depends on the individual. Some people, I mean, it's just a convenient room that is just set aside for like meditation and devotion. A lot of Burmese houses have this. They just set a room aside for the shrine room. And, you're not allowed to do worldly stuff in there. It's just sort of like a pure space, which, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. Poorer people that don't really have the option of having a separate room just for that. Sometimes they'll have built onto the side of their house. If you go to Burma, sometimes you'll see built onto the side of like a wooden house, this niche thing sticking out from the house. And that is a way of having like a Buddhist shrine kind of in your house, but at the same time, it's sort of separated away from this worldly stuff of like people, pooping and having sex and that kind of thing. Not at the same time, but still, just this worldliness stuff. It's sort of like a symbolic separation from that. And a lot of like monks' cabins will have like that niche thing, just like this lump sticking out of one wall, where the Buddha image is, like the little shrine is. It's not necessary though. I mean, if you're not into idolatry, it's just, you're like an iconoclast or something, then, I mean, that's fine too. I mean, the first few hundred years of Buddhism, there were no Buddha statues. They might still have had shrines of a type, but it would be, a Bodhi leaf or, an empty throne or something representing, the Buddha, but at the same time emphasizing the fact that he was no longer in samsara, he had left the scene. So some people might be more attached to rites and rituals as a result of that, but not everybody. Some people can navigate that fairly skillfully. And I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Xenothoid. And Xenothoid This is a long one. This is a long essay question, which I already answered once, but I'm going to answer it again. Xenothoid says, can you please give your thoughts on this argument against materialism? And then this is what follows is the argument. He says, the way I like to argue against materialism goes like this. Imagine I am the materialist. My perception, quote, my perception of truth is a product of my neurochemistry. My neurochemistry is constantly changing and could change in such a way that fundamental truths would appear blatantly wrong. Therefore, I have no way to justify that my perception of truth at the moment is actually lining up with the objective truth of the physical world. The only reason I believe that what I understand to be true right now is actually true is that my neurochemical state is like this more often than not, unquote. The materialist may not appeal to other minds, but materialism has no good way to argue against solipsism. An idealist can say to a solipsist, quote, if your mind was the only one, then you should be omniscient because the knowledge would have no other minds to escape to, unquote. A materialist can't use that kind of argument because they think knowledge is not a real thing and just a side effect of neurochemicals. For the materialist, the ultimate truth of reality is in matter, which they can never access directly. For the Buddhist, ultimate reality is directly experienceable through consciousness. Okay, so, I mean, the whole thing about solipsism, I don't think that's really a very good argument. The idealist argument against solipsism, namely, if your mind was the only one, then you should be omniscient. Because, I mean, just because your mind contains all the knowledge that is accessible, well, yeah, I mean, you'd still be limited. I mean, let's say there's a solipsism, which is like you are the only being that exists in the entire universe, and all other beings are just sort of like a dream that you're having. But still, you wouldn't know the cube root of 96. Presumably, there is a cube root of 96, and you wouldn't know it. So, I mean, you still wouldn't be omniscient. It's just that it's kind of hard to explain. But, I mean, you don't know how many hairs are on your own head unless you're completely bald. Well, I don't know. But that's not even really the question. The question up here is, could I please give my thoughts on the argument against materialism? And it's not going to make much of an impression on like a scientific realist. The scientific realist will acknowledge, fine, when you're diseased, when you're out of your mind, then you might be just hallucinating, in which case you can't trust your own mind. But when you've got a consensus, or at least, an overwhelming majority of scientists who are all like doing the same kind of experiments, verifying what other scientists have done, reproducing their experiments, then there's going to be enough of a correlation between what is out there presumably causing our perceptions and what we are perceiving. I mean, that's what like a scientific realist would argue, something along those lines, that there is a correspondence between what we are perceiving most of the time when we're in our right mind and we're being logical and rational and empirical, especially when you've got like an agreement of many different scientists, that they just assume that there has to be some reality out there beyond our perceptions that is causing our perceptions. And it's causing them to be in this consistent way that can then be like codified and you make mathematical models of it and so forth and apply that to the external world. Even though we don't have direct access to the external world, still scientists would assume that there's bound to be a correlation between our perceptions and an external world, especially when you've got so many people agreeing and reproducing scientific experiments and all that. So I do not think that the argument against materialism produced by Xenothoid would really make much of an impression on someone who is firmly committed to scientific materialism. I mean, my favorite argument, I don't know if you can even really prove that there's no physical matter out there, but one argument that I like is just George Berkeley. George Berkeley lived back in the 1700s. He was like he lived in Ireland a lot of the time. I think he was like an Anglican vicar living in Ireland. And I think it was before he became the Anglican vicar, he wrote his philosophical texts about immaterialism. And George Berkeley had this theory that all that exists in the entire universe is consciousness and perceptions, minds and perceptions. As a Christian, I don't know why he didn't say souls and perceptions, but he had this idea, all that exists is minds and perceptions. But there's this one central mind that coordinates the perceptions of all the other minds. And that central mind is God. And so, according to Berkeley, when you see an apple sitting on the table, you're not really seeing a physical apple sitting on a physical table. It's just that God is implanting the perceptions into your mind as though you're seeing a physical apple on a physical table. And the thing is, I don't think Berkeley was right. But I have to admit, I cannot prove that Berkeley was wrong. People have been trying to prove, like philosophers have been trying to prove Berkeley wrong for centuries at this point, at least a few centuries. And to my knowledge, none of them has succeeded. I don't know how they could possibly succeed unless you want to use the argument of just like radical monism, that ultimate reality is just this undifferentiated, just unified essence with no multiplicity whatsoever. You could use that kind of argument, like a very deep metaphysical kind of argument. But so long as you're going to accept like a phenomenal world with phenomena going on, then I don't know how you could possibly prove that physical matter does exist. And I'm not so sure you could prove that it doesn't exist either. So long as you're accepting like a pluralistic, phenomenal world that is real. But if you can go to a deeper level of metaphysics and just kind of admit that all multiplicity is an illusion, then maybe you could prove Berkeley wrong in that way, at least within the context of the initial assumptions. So I guess I just better move on to the next question. I'm just perversely digressing and taking more time than necessary. I guess it's just the way I am. Cut me some slack. So, Xenothoid's second question, which I've answered before, but nobody listened to me because they couldn't, because the microphone wasn't working. Xenothoid says, what are your thoughts on the no true Scotsman fallacy? Personally, I think it's a confusion of conventional truth and ultimate truth. Ultimately, there is no Muslim, but to say at the conventional level that there is no true Muslim would imply that there is also no false Muslim, and therefore the word Muslim loses all meaning. At that point, I can call Sam Harris a Muslim. And this Muslim stuff, I don't fully follow. Just see, if there is no true Muslim, it would imply that there is no false Muslim. That's not necessarily the case. Like going with conventional truth, there's no true unicorn, but there's lots of false unicorns. Fictional unicorns, for example. So, you can have a false unicorn without having a true unicorn. Likewise, maybe you could have a false Muslim without having a true Muslim. But let's just get up to the no true Scotsman fallacy, which I didn't really fully know what the no true Scotsman fallacy was, and I had to look it up. And so I think it was the AI associated with DuckDuckGo came up with this. The no true Scotsman fallacy is a logical error where someone defends a generalization by excluding counterexamples, claiming that those who don't fit the generalization are not true members of the group. This fallacy often involves shifting definitions to protect a belief or argument from criticism. And I guess the original example of the no true Scotsman fallacy is someone makes the statement, no Scotsman would put sugar on his porridge. And for a Scotsman, I assume the porridge would be oatmeal. So let's just go with oatmeal. So somebody says, no Scotsman would put sugar on his oatmeal. And then this other person says, well, my Uncle Angus, who lives in Aberdeen, Scotland, was born and raised there. He put sugar on his oatmeal. So then the first person kind of deflects and says, well, no true Scotsman would put sugar on his oatmeal. And so that implies that it's just practically by definition that if you put sugar on your oatmeal, you can't really be a Scotsman. So I don't think that that's the confusion of like, let's see, conventional truth and ultimate truth. Because ultimate truth, I mean, you can't even put it into words. Ultimate truth is just beyond language, beyond symbols. So this is mainly just moving the goalposts and trying to redefine the term to like prevent any counterexamples from coming up. You know, it's moving the goalposts, and it's mainly just a person who wants to be considered infallible on this point. And so it's like they just redefine the term how they please, regardless of how you would define the term. Like you might think that it's not impossible for a Scottish person, Scottish man, to put sugar on his oatmeal. But they just redefine the term. And that happens in politics all the time. Happens all the time. So, yeah, I don't think it's a confusion of conventional truth and ultimate truth. I just think it's like a stubborn person who makes this blanket generalization. And then when somebody provides a counterexample that, you know, disagrees with the blanket generalization, they just sort of change the definition to exclude any counterexamples. So in a way, it's just sort of doubling down and refusing to admit that your generalization has exceptions to it. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Master Poe. And Master Poe says, I've been going for an hour. We still haven't got to 153 yet. Master Poe says, sitting here watching yet another near-death experience story, and the person was describing the communication process, which was telepathic, very common aspect of near-death experiences, but it's always the person's native language, makes me wonder why not an otherworldly language one never heard of yet comprehended as if it was the personal native tongue. What say you, Panyobasa? I think a lot of the time it could be just sort of assuming that near-death experiences have validity, and just assuming that every once in a while you might have some sort of paranormal communication, that it could be just that just the knowledge is sort of implanted into your mind, which you then translate into your own language. But then again, in a near-death experience, the standard type where, you know, you die, you rise up, you go through, like, you go towards this bright light, you wind up in a heaven realm. You've got a spirit guide there who, you know, discusses things with you, asks you maybe if you want to go back, you know, just sort of points out to you that some of the mistakes you've made, that kind of thing. Then you probably see their mouth moving in sync with the English that you're hearing, which would indicate that it is like a kind of is mentally generated, sort of like in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, where it's talking about how after you die, you're in the Bardo realm, you're going to be seeing all these beings, you're going to be seeing Buddhas, you're going to be seeing demons, you're going to be seeing all this stuff. Some of them will communicate to you, but you have to bear in mind that it's all mind-made. It's all a figment of your imagination. And I mean, from the Tibetan point of view and from some Buddhist point of view, I mean, this whole world is like a figment of our imagination. So why not otherworldly language? It kind of reminds me of when I'm dreaming, I generally can't read very much in a dream. You know, a sign with just a few words on it, or like a book that just has like a title on the cover, that much my imagination can handle, like spontaneously. But like an entire page of text, then my imagination is not good enough for me to dream an entire page of text that I can read in the dream. And so I think it's kind of along the lines of that you just can't come up with like a whole new language that you will understand like spontaneously as you're generating this experience. And it's pretty clear that to some degree at least, people who have these near-death experiences are generating their experience. Like Christians will have, in some cases, Jesus or Mary or some Christian patriarch or saint or this kind of thing, that it's the spirit guide. And a Buddhist would have a different kind of a different kind of heaven realm that they're going to. A Muslim would have a different kind of heaven realm. A materialist would have a different kind of heaven realm. So it's very much conditioned by your mind. And that's not to say that it's completely bogus, because to some degree, what we're experiencing now is generated by our mind. So I better just move on to the next one. I really should try to get these down to 20 words or less. My answer is just, yep, next question. Nope, next question. Stellar Supreme is the next questioner, formerly known as Liber Lamb, etc., 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 etc. He changes his name all the time. Or at least he did. Enough to be troublesome. So let's see here. Stellar Supreme, etc., etc. says, which is better in your opinion, paccekabuddha yana or bodhisattva yana? And this is with regard to a discussion, a very brief discussion of the Lotus Sutra that took place on the Discord server. So Stellar Supreme continues, a paccekabuddha is one of the greatest sources of merit in that they're an ideal receiver of charity for the giver, whereas there seems to be no mention of merit tied to one who has made a commitment to someday be perfectly purified and liberated. Well, I mean, this is just an academic argument, I think. I mean, I'm not really a Mahayana Buddhist. I'm not so sure that there really is a paccekabuddha yana, and the bodhisattva yana is an anachronistic artifact of Buddhist philosophy. I mean, the bodhisattva yana would be someone striving to become a Buddha, I suppose. But the paccekabuddha yana isn't someone striving to become a paccekabuddha. It's like paccekabuddhas. So it's sort of apples and oranges to some degree. And paccekabuddhas, I mean, I answered a question about paccekabuddhas a few Q&As ago, where really the Buddha, or maybe it didn't even originate with the Buddha, but the idea of paccekabuddhas may be just a way of accounting for enlightened beings before the Buddha's time that weren't Buddhists. So, which is better in my opinion? I mean, it's just an academic matter of opinion, I guess. I really can't. I mean, if you're saying that, who would be more like meritorious to donate to, a bodhisattva or a paccekabuddha? Well, a paccekabuddha is a Buddha, whereas a bodhisattva is someone who's just trying to become one. So, I mean, you get more merit from like interacting with a paccekabuddha, although they'd be pretty much of a hermit and wouldn't talk much. They wouldn't be explaining Dhamma very much to you, but just being in their presence, offering alms food or whatever. Yeah, I mean, you're offering, on the one hand, to a fully enlightened being, supposedly higher or more advanced than an ordinary fully enlightened being, an arahant. And then the other hand, a bodhisattva, I mean, they could have just started on their bodhisattva path and still be just laden with defilements and so forth. But, I mean, in a way, it's not really a fair competition, because you've got paccekabuddhas are already fully enlightened, whereas a bodhisattva is someone destined to become a sammasambuddha. And if you're going to compare paccekabuddhas with sammasambuddhas, then I think Orthodox tradition might say it would be more beneficial to offer to the sammasambuddha, but I mean, both of them are fully enlightened beings. I'm just going to move on to Stellar Supreme, etc., etc. Second question. Did you enjoy being in a monastery less than solitary practice despite the difficulties of living outside the monastery? Yeah, as a general rule, I avoided monasteries. If you're trying to practice Vinaya strictly, as a general rule, you have to avoid monasteries, especially Asian monasteries, because there's almost no monastery in all of Burma where it's not technically against the rules even to just set foot on the property. Any monastery that has been paid for, at least in part, even 1 penny, 1 pya, by a monk, that's it. I mean, it's nisagiya pachitya, and it's a dukkha offense, an offense of wrongdoing, to make use of that. Like the standard example I've said more than once in the past, in the commentaries, a monk buys a mango with money, which is he has transgressed by buying this mango. He eats the mango and throws the pit. The pit germinates, grows into a tree. 100 years later, a different monk sits under the shade of that tree. he's breaking a rule. He's committing an offense of making use of something that was paid for by a monk's money. So there have been monks. There was a famous Italian monk back in British times in Burma who just avoided monasteries. He would not go into a monastery, maybe very briefly or something, but as a general rule, he just avoided monasteries. He wandered from place to place and just slept in, like, they're called a zayat. It's just like a public, like a shelter, just a roof on posts with like a raised wooden platform, and people can rest there. You know, there's usually water pots there that you can drink from, that kind of thing. So, I mean, to some degree, it was like that with me. I generally avoided other monks as whenever possible, and just preferred to be living in solitude. The one monastery I lived at longer than any other place. I lived there for, 10 years approximately. Most of the time I was living there was only 2 monks there, me and one other monk who lived down by the river. I lived up on the hill, and he eventually got bitten by a cobra and died. Then I was by myself there for a while. And so, I mean, you could have the best of both worlds. Just have live in a very crude monastery. I mean, still, some of the buildings there probably were paid for with monks' money, but that monastery property was just owned by the Sangha, didn't have to be paid for. It had been there for hundreds of years. There was like medieval ruins just right outside the boundaries of that monastery, where there apparently had been another monastery, like possibly almost 1,000 years ago. So, yeah, I liked living alone in the forest. That it was like camping, and you didn't have to worry with all the culture barrier stuff with Burmese monks, and also the monastic discipline stuff with Burmese monks handling money. 98% of them handle it. And so it's just like, you want to avoid this kind of corrupt stuff in your practical Buddhism. You're better off just going alone like the horn of the rhinoceros. And I took that to heart, and I did prefer it that way. And so I'm just going to move on to Stellar Supreme, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera's third question. Could you provide some of the details of the fish pond, like how long it took to dig and the materials you're using? Well, I was digging the fish pond. I'm done digging it now, but I was digging the fish pond as a general rule, 1 day per week. I mean, I work my butt off at work 5 days a week, and I wanted to have at least 1 day of glorious laziness, which was generally Saturday, which would be the day I would record these Q&As. And so Sundays, I would dig maybe, I think on average it was about 8 wheelbarrow loads. I'd use a mattock and a shovel and a wheelbarrow. That's pretty much all I used for digging the pond. And bless their hearts, women just do not fully appreciate the value of a mattock. I mean, you use the mattock to chop up hard ground, make it soft, and then you just scoop up the loose dirt with a shovel instead of trying to get that shovel into the hard ground, hitting rocks and so forth. The mattock makes it way easier. And so last weekend, we put in the liner and put water in it. Now there's fish in there, although 2 of them were dead this morning. I think they just overate because I put some bloodworms in the pond. I was going to try and inoculate the pond with like some biodiversity, and I think that these 2 big goldfish that we bought, they bought them at the same time out of the same tank at the same fish store. So it could be that they were just like had some kind of disease or something. But it also could be that they just, both of them gorged on these worms I threw in there and just gorged themselves to death. So, I mean, dig a hole in the ground, line it with, first it was like put a little bit of sand, then put in like this felt underlayment. And then we got like this super heavy duty pond liner made by Firestone. It's made pretty much out of the same material that like inner tubes are made out of. And eventually we're going to get some rocks. Tomorrow I'm going to try and set up the pond filter because the water is still kind of murky. So we're going to put a pond filter with a little fountain in there, and it's off to the races. And after that, all we got to do really is just line the outside with ornamental rocks. And my sweetheart is trying to pressure me into digging like a notch around the entire pond, even though the liner's already in, so that you can put the rocks like down closer to the water. The water level can come up to the rocks without completely overflowing, and then you don't see as much liner. But place we lived at before, we had a fish pond, and that wasn't done. And I'm kind of resisting the extra work of cutting this notch or all the way around the pond to make the liner a little bit less visible. So yeah, when it's finally done, I'll probably do a Q&A, hopefully kind of late fall, where it's not totally sweltering outside, with the pond behind me so everyone can gaze upon it in awe and wonder. And we went out today looking for fish. I was trying to find some dojo loaches to put in the pond, and there was one fish store. We hit pretty much all the fish stores. There was one fish store that had dojo loaches, but they were the wrong color. I didn't like them, so I didn't get them. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is the last question of the previous Q&A that I've already answered. And then we're really going to start getting into genuine 153 after this. And this last question from the previous Q&A that I've already answered is from Nirmit. And Nirmit says, what would the Buddha say about illegal immigrants? Do you think he will be in favor of deporting them? And again, second guessing the attitudes or opinions or mental states of a fully enlightened being is pretty much of a fool's errand. I've made an entire video not too long ago. Just people are continually asking me, what would the Buddha think? Or what would the Buddha say? Or what are the mental states of an enlightened being like? And it's pretty much pointless. The only way you could possibly understand what it's like to be a fully enlightened being would be to be a fully enlightened being. You can try to explain to a dog what being a human is like, and the dog isn't going to get it. It might pay very careful attention, might be gazing up at you in rapt attention, just loving the attention it's getting. But still, it's not going to understand anything. So what would the Buddha say about illegal immigrants? Well, there is a Vinaya rule where the Buddha says, I allow you monks to obey kings. And so, I mean, from the Buddhist point of view, that you renounce society. If you're a serious Buddhist, you become a monk or a nun, you renounce society. You go off and live in the forest and let worldly minded lay people figure out all this political stuff. So, I mean, I assume the Buddha would admit that it is the king's right to kick out illegal invaders who are not in the country legally. I assume he would be okay with that. It's not like you look at X, some of the hysterical posts put up by Democrats about how, ICE is the new Gestapo and all this, and not really. I mean, they're just enforcing American laws, and there's a law that, you're going to be in this country, you have to be in this country legally. Just crashing the border without a visa or a passport or anything, and then just going into hiding, avoiding the authorities, that's illegal. And I don't think the Buddha would be opposed to law enforcement. He would admit that sometimes law enforcement involves unethical activity, especially punishing criminals. There were some really gruesome punishments for criminals in the Buddha's time. There's some really gruesome lists of some of the public execution methods, like drill a hole into the top of a live criminal's skull and pour in molten lead, or cutting their skin off in strips. And that was done in public back in those days. It was well into modern times, like in London, there'd be people publicly hanged. People have gotten a lot softer and wimpier now, which is not entirely a bad thing, but it's not entirely a good thing either. But the Buddha, first of all, it would be, that is not my concern. It's not the Sangha's concern That's for the kings to work out in their worldly lives, working out their worldly problems. And I don't think that he would be outspoken against law enforcement. The Buddha would not want to defund the police unless it was some sort of really bad kind of police, like the secret kind of police that's knocking on doors in the middle of the night and disappearing people. Maybe he would disapprove of that. So that's the end. And like I always should say at the beginning and never do. And I'm not even going to say it now because we're not even at the end. We're just starting 153 now. And this next question is from Trzaskaziz. And Trzaskaziz says, is there any way to reconcile capital punishment with Dhamma? No, not really. There is the story of there was a monk who was advising the public executioner to keep his axe sharpened, really sharp, and try to just finish off the criminal with one blow. And he had committed a parajika offense, as in that he was helping someone to kill other people. So, yeah, you can't really reconcile capital punishment with Dhamma, other than pretty much like what I was saying with regard to deporting illegal aliens, where, I mean, that is the king's business, and we are Sangha, we're just renouncing society, going off, living on the outskirts of society, and the government can just work out their own shit. That's how you'd reconcile it. But with regard to ethics, killing another human being, even like euthanasia, is not good from a Buddhist point of view. I mean, it might be the lesser of two evils in some cases, but still, it's an evil. It is unwholesome. So I'm just going to move on to Trzaska's second question, which is, from a purely materialistic point of view, wouldn't killing a 9-year-old be much worse morally than 90 years old? Former has entire life ahead of him, and the latter has had one already. Well, from a purely materialistic point of view, I don't think there is such a thing as morals. I mean, a purely materialistic point of view would be just morally destitute. There'd be no moral code from a purely materialistic point of view, as far as I can tell. So, I mean, from a purely materialistic point of view, ethics are just sort of a social tool, just arbitrarily cooked up for the sake of maintaining society in a more or less stable manner, something like that. But, I mean, there would be no universal ethical code from a purely materialistic point of view. And then from, the Buddhist point of view, strangely, the Orthodox Theravada point of view is like killing a being becomes more unwholesome the more effort is required to kill that being. So, it's like the implication is a bigger, more conscious being would be harder to kill. It'd be harder to kill an elephant than a mosquito. So that's why killing an elephant is worse. But I don't think it's really good logic. I mean, you could just kill an elephant. I'm not advising anyone kill elephants, by the way. But you could just shoot an elephant with a high-powered rifle, which would be fairly easy. Whereas killing that mosquito, you might be rushing through the house, just swearing and swatting again and again, missing and missing and missing, just raging at this mosquito, in which case it would be easier to kill the elephant than the mosquito. But then again, all that raging and swearing and so forth would be adding to the unwholesomeness of just going, and you're done. But yeah, from a purely materialistic point of view, I don't think there is any morals other than just an arbitrary social construct, or a social construct designed to stabilize society, something like that. So I'm just going to move on to Trzaska's third question. He starts off with a quote. In Laos, it is illegal for a foreign citizen to engage in sexual activity with a Lao national outside of marriage. This restriction applies regardless of the gender of the individuals involved. Cohabitation, even without sexual activity, is also prohibited for unmarried foreign and Lao nationals, unquote. And then Trezaskazis asks, are there any restrictions in that matter in Myanmar or Cambodia? Well, I can't really speak for Cambodia. I've never been in Cambodia. My knowledge of Cambodia is rather limited. But with regard to Myanmar, I don't think there's anything like this. For example, there's like a rising sex industry, or there was before I left Myanmar. I left in 2018. What changes have happened since then, I really can't say firsthand. You know, I can hear rumors, secondhand news, that kind of thing. But before I left Myanmar, there was starting to be like a sex industry, sex tourism, trying to compete with Thailand to some degree. And I don't think the government really cared. Maybe they were getting kickbacks or making some kind of profit from it. I never heard anything like this, that it was illegal for like a Burmese woman to have sex with like a non-Burmese man, you know, like a non-citizen in Burma. I never heard of it. I mean, maybe, for example, I've heard that it's legal. Polygamy is legal in Burma, but I never saw a case of it the whole time I was living in Burma. So it could be just, it's on the books somewhere, but not enforced. So let's see here. Did I answer that question? I think I did. Yeah, I mean, like, cohabitation of unmarried people is frowned upon in Burmese society. It may be that they don't even need to make a law, that it would just be done by stealth, just because, you know, everyone would have like a low opinion of the Burmese person, especially. You know, you got some Burmese woman living in sin with like any man, and, you know, she'd be considered to be like a prostitute. You know, that her reputation would just be ruined, regardless of whether the guy she was living with was Burmese or not. I mean, it was like that in the West up until relatively recently, well into modern times. Then along came feminism. So let's see here. I guess I answered that question. I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Austin. And Austin is asking a question about Madhyamaka. So I just happen to have the Madhyamaka fez here. Let's see, got this out of the way there. There we go. So Austin says the Mula Madhyamaka Karaka rejects metaphysical absolutes. This would necessitate an objection to parinirvana, a transcendent state beyond samsara. How do we square this circle? Well, the Mula Madhyamaka Karaka rejects metaphysical absolutes, mainly in the sense of talking about them or trying to symbolize them. I mean, really, that's all you can do if you're like writing or talking, is using symbols, and they're just not going to apply to reality. So all you can really do, if you're being logically rigorous, is just say it's all invalid, because, I mean, you can't even point. I mean, it's beyond even pointing a finger at the moon. It's you can't even point to ultimate reality. Ultimate reality is just completely off the scale. You can't say a word about it and have it be valid, really. And as my understanding of Madhyamaka is along those lines, it's like you can't even really talk about metaphysical absolutes or a metaphysical absolute like nirvana, that as soon as you mention it, you just go off the scale. You just go off the tracks, really, because it's not valid. You've tried to symbolize what can't be symbolized. So, in a way, I mean, Madhyamaka, you can't really theorize enlightenment. I don't think that Madhyamaka Buddhists are declaring that there's no such thing as an enlightened being. There's no such thing as a Buddha, anything like that. It's just anything you say about it is going to be invalid. So you just shut up. I mean, that's one of the main points of Madhyamaka is sort of like Zen, or like the Atthakavagga of the Sutta Nipata, where you just shoot down all beliefs. The Atthakavagga says, don't believe anything, have no views, no position. And that would include any position regarding enlightenment. But that doesn't mean that there is no enlightenment. It's just that enlightenment is so off the scale, you can't say anything about it. And then one way of getting there is just shutting down all your views, including your views about enlightenment. So my understanding of Madhyamaka is it works along those lines. It's just, you just shoot down all symbolic views, including symbolic views that would be considered right view in other schools, and including any views about enlightenment or nirvana, anything like that. And all that's left behind is this unthinkable void, and the reality is there. You can't think about it. You can't symbolize it. You can't talk about it. But you can't even say it's there because you're still talking about it. So it's just radical. It's not even skepticism. It's radical mysticism in the guise of this logic that just destroys all views. And that's good, because mysticism, or like direct knowledge of reality, cannot be contained in a view. It cannot be contained in a belief, a concept. So you just shoot down all concepts, including all concepts about nirvana and enlightenment. Because it doesn't help. It just gets in the way. It's like a stumbling block. So I hope I answered that question. Yeah. So I'm going to take the fez back off and move on to Austin's next question, which is, oops, I think I did something to the computer. I put the fez down on my sweetheart's computer. Okay. So Austin says, if you take mind-only idealism as your starting point, don't you think you're closer to Vedanta than Buddhism? I don't really take mind-only idealism. I'm more inclined to go along with the Paccekabuddha and Madhyamaka than Vedanta, because Vedanta still makes the mistake of positing this like mind-only, or positing positing anything. To assert anything, you're already off the tracks. You're off the path, essentially. Unless it's like a very elementary level of that path. So let's see. Take mind-only idealism as your starting point. Yeah, that's still just conventional truth. I don't consider physical matter to be real, but ultimately, no belief is going to contain reality. But yeah, Vedanta, if I weren't a Buddhist, there's a good chance I'd be a Vedantist. But still, Vedanta is reifying the absolute to a much greater degree than early Buddhism did. Just reifying the absolute, regardless of whatever you consider the absolute to be, including infinite formless consciousness, still, you have just tried to symbolize that. You think that you're describing it in words, and you just can't. It's just like delusion. But I would consider Vedanta to be my second choice after Buddhism. So I'm just going to move on to Austin's third question. If science one day finds out that the mind is produced by material functions in the brain, will it be over for Buddhism? I don't think so. I don't think that would be nearly as much of a blow to Buddhism as Jesus not coming soon was to early Christians. So, science is never going to prove that. Really, it's like Immanuel Kant said, more than 200 years ago, pretty sure, that science will never come, no matter how advanced science gets, it can never come one iota closer to understanding the thing in itself. The highest truth, ultimate reality. Science can't touch it. It can't get close to it. Neither can any kind of belief system. Any kind of symbols are not going to be able to explain or describe what cannot be symbolized without just perverting it beyond all recognition. So, science may have already found out somehow that the mind is produced by material function in the brain. Most scientists believe that. They don't know how it happens. They already believe it. But that doesn't mean that it's over for Buddhism. Science, even if, they come up with better evidence for it, that kind of thing. still, I mean, I don't think that it's going to undermine Buddhism in any way, other than the Buddhists of weak faith who have more faith in scientism than in Dharma. And there's quite a few of those in the West. So I guess I'm just better move on to the next question. I really do want to keep this under 4 hours if possible. This is from Psst, and Psst says, what do you do for your pond during a hurricane? Fish in the sky with diamonds. Well, I don't think the hurricane would necessarily kill the fish. I mean, the wind would just blow, it might blow the fence down. But I mean, it's not just going to scoop up 400 gallons of water and just blow it away. I mean, if it does, well, we'll just deal with that when it happens, I guess. I mean, maybe here is referring more to tornadoes, which might actually just suck all the water out. And of course, if it gets that close to the house, it's going to suck the house up too. So we probably aren't going to be around worrying about it after it happens. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Phil Lathes again. This is now his 5th question, because in all fairness to Phil Lathes, he asked 3 plus maybe a rhetorical question in the previous Q&A, which got answered but didn't get recorded properly. Better make sure, yes, like the little green bar is still going wiggling on the OSB, or OBS, I mean. Let's see, what was I saying? Phil Lathes. Okay, this is Phil Lathes' first question for 153. And he says, a Zen monk wrote, quote, there is no absolute reality outside of real things. Though reality is more than the things that are real, this more is in the very things. And though this more is beyond the part that can be known through the intellect, it can be known. One draws near this reality of realities when the mind has learned to discard all things superfluous, unquote. And then he says, Phil Lathes says, thoughts? Well, I mean, yeah, this is pretty much in agreement with like my simile of the block of marble. You know, all these statues are contained in the block of marble. The block of marble would be considered like the essence, the reality of the statues. So, yeah, I guess that's fairly good. See, there is no absolute reality outside of real things. I mean, that's kind of tautological or something. I mean, why would he say outside of real things? I mean, from a Buddhist, from even a Zen point of view, real things is kind of problematic right there. And then see, the reality is more than things that are real. This more is in the very things. Yeah, sort of like the rock, the stone is in the imaginary statues. I mean, the imaginary statues made of real rock that are just contained potentially or conditionally, virtually in that rock. So, yeah, that's one way of putting it. I don't really have any objection to that. Although, of course, you can't really explain reality in words. So we just, in a way, it's just kind of blind people talking about colors. So let's see here. Let's just move on to Phil Lathes again. His next question, how do we know that depth isn't enough to dispel all of, death. I had the little cursor thing covering the A. I thought it said depth. How do we know that death isn't enough to dispel all of our karma that results in rebirth? Well, you can't know that. How are you gonna know that it does or it doesn't? I mean, just going with Buddhist philosophy, assuming certain Buddhist assumptions, then I mean, there's going to be a certain momentum of your mental states, and then if that momentum suddenly gets cut off at death, I mean, you die suddenly, for example, then it's like a conservation of energy in a sense, conservation of momentum, so that the momentum has to continue somehow, just even though it's not in this particular form. But I mean, if you want to be like just a skeptic, you can doubt everything. So how do we know that death isn't enough to dispel all? Why even bother with going with that? Why not even just deny karma? There you go. You can just be skeptical that there's any karma at all, that karma even means anything. I mean, most materialist types, they don't deal with karma unless it's like an instant karma video they're watching on YouTube or TikTok or something. They certainly don't believe in rebirth. But there have been some people like, what was his name? Nisargadatta Maharaj. He used to say that there really is no reincarnation. There have been some guru types that have denied rebirth. But then again, Nisargadatta Maharaj agreed with the first noble truth of Buddhism, that to exist is to suffer. So why didn't he just why didn't he just come to the conclusion that we should all just auto-terminate? If that's the truth, I mean, if you believe the first noble truth, to exist is to suffer, and you think at death, it's just, that's it. The suffering just stops forever. But Buddhism doesn't teach that, which is good. I mean, you don't want just all Buddhists to just auto-terminate. Or at least some Muslims or, some like radical atheists, intolerant atheists or something might be fine with that. But I don't think it's, I just don't see it that way. I just intuitively, based on my understanding of how things work, I really don't think that it's YOLO and when you're dead, you're dead. Regardless of whether there's any karma or not. So, take a sip of my now cold coffee and move on to the next question. Because I really do have to be a little more concise, even though I'm not doing a very good job of it. So, Philalethes' 7th question. If being a monk requires living off alms, then any monk community requires an even bigger lay community to support it. This means that if monkhood is a requirement to reach enlightenment, then only a certain limited minority of people can ever achieve enlightenment at any given point in time. Is this true? Well, I've already pointed out that even the overwhelming majority of sincere, diligently, wholeheartedly striving spiritual practitioners, monks and nuns, that most of them still don't become enlightened. That it's just the way it is. It's like, I don't know how to say it. It's just the way it is that most beings in this world are not ripe for enlightenment, regardless of whether monks have to be supported by lay people or not. It's just the way it is. So the system is kind of set up based on the empirical fact that most people are just kind of worldly minded normies, and they don't even want enlightenment. Not now, anyway. They might be praying for it in some future time, sort of like St. Augustine was, like praying to God to get rid of his sins, but not quite yet. That kind of thing. I remember there was this beggar woman that used to like sweep the grounds at Mahagandhi on the big school monastery, and some of the monks would be teasing her, saying, "Oh, you're making such merit, you're going to attain Nibbana." And she said, "I don't want to go to Nibbana. There's no tea shops in Nibbana." And that's pretty much the attitude of most Buddhists, I think, except maybe they have a higher priority than tea shops. Well, yeah, I mean, it's just the system isn't like limiting the number of enlightened beings or any such thing. It's just the fact that most beings are not even ready for enlightenment. They don't even really want enlightenment. Is kind of that was taken into account when the system was being set up. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Yuga'u. And Yuga'u says, please tell us in detail, how did you practice deconstruction of a person before having any interaction with it? How did that help you practice, and how can that help us in life? Well, I assume what Yuga'u is referring to when he says deconstruction of a person is that a monk who's being mindful, like deeply mindful, in the seen, there's only the seen, in the heard, there's only the heard, in the mentally sensed, there's only the mentally sensed, this kind of thing. The felt, there's only the felt. Then when you're confronted with another human being, then you're seeing them. The seen is only the seen. It's just this form that is being seen. If they're speaking to you, in the heard, there is only the heard. It's just sounds. And then you're deconstructing the person through just your senses as visual stimuli, auditory stimuli. They touch you. It's tactile stimuli, that kind of thing. Then, I mean, that's practicing like relatively advanced Dhamma. I think most people really couldn't do that at a very, very high level for very long. I mean, just naturally, you've got just built into your human nature, there's like face recognition and just, voice recognition and, just understanding what words mean rather than just hearing blah, blah, blah. So, yeah, how did I practice deconstruction before having any interaction with it? With the person, you mean? I don't fully understand this question. But really, I mean, if you're just practicing mindfulness, in the seen, there's only the seen. In the heard, there is only the heard. In the felt, there is only the felt. In the mentally sensed, there is only the mentally sensed. Then, I mean, that just automatically deconstructs a person into like sensory stimuli. I mean, it's just like the result of it, of the practice. So I guess that answers that question. And then how did that help you practice, and how can that help us in life? Well, I mean, you're like getting rid of the interpretation, which is most of samsara. It's like you are weakening samsara. You're like diluting it down. And then it's more attenuated. It's easier to see through it or free yourself from it. Because if you're just wallowing in the inner monologue and the interpretations of things, you're just taking everything at face value. You see a person standing in front of you, and that's George. He's my buddy, and he likes this and he doesn't like that, and he tells funny jokes and just on and on and on. I mean, you're just enmeshed in samsara at that point. Whereas you look upon George and it's just visual stimuli, auditory stimuli, then George is kind of disappeared in a sense, and samsara is very much reduced. And then it's easier to free yourself from samsara if you're not just like wallowing just over your head in it. I mean, helping you in life, I mean, it just might help you to not be as unhappy. I mean, it's like women will get pissed off at you if you like you're cohabiting with a woman and you're just seeing her as sensory stimuli. You're not acknowledging her humanity, that kind of thing. Yeah, she might get pissed off at you. But so helping you in life in that sense, I mean, you're better off if you're going to this level of practice, then you're better off living out in the woods, just avoiding other people for the most part. I mean, this radical practice, you're trying to like reduce samsara as much as you can to make it easier to transcend samsara. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is Stellar Supreme again, etc., etc., etc. And he says, can a monk sleep on his belly? Well, I don't see why not. I personally cannot sleep on my belly. I mean, when I was a kid, sometimes I did, but I somehow outgrew it, and I just really can't sleep on my belly anymore. I'm kind of sway-backed as it is, and it makes me even more feel like really sway-backed if I'm lying on my belly. Maybe if I put a pillow under my belly or something. Maybe I think there's a few times when I was really sick in Burma, and the beds and even hospital beds are just like a wooden pallet with like a little bamboo mat on the top of that. So I remember the first time I had malaria, I pretty much, within 2 days of being on a hospital bed, a wooden, hard hospital bed, and being barely able to even stand up, that I just wore out all the comfortable positions. And so sometimes in desperation, I just roll over onto my belly or something just to be in a position that didn't hurt, that kind of thing. But there's no rule against a monk sleeping on his belly. So, I mean, that's not really a problem. So yeah, a monk can sleep on his belly. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Xenothoid. And Xenothoid says, have you read Sun Tzu's The Art of War? And yeah, I actually have. In fact, one of the most memorable things of me reading The Art of War was I was traveling with a guy named Steve. Steve had very generously and kindly volunteered to drive me from Bellingham, Washington, all the way to California. And so we were on this road trip together, and he wanted to stop at this ski resort and do some snowboarding. And being a monk, dressed in like a brown toga and flip-flops. I was wearing flip-flops. I usually went barefoot, but in this case I was wearing flip-flops because it was well below freezing. That's the coldest weather I ever was exposed to as a monk. Was up on this mountain at this ski resort, snow on the ground, ice, below freezing. And so I just stayed in the lodge. And I remember I was just this monk in the ski lodge reading The Art of War by Sun Tzu. So I have read it. Yeah, so the answer to that is yep. So Xenothoid's next question. What do you think of using militaristic language in the context of Buddhism, primarily that which personifies the kilesas as enemies to be fought? Well, there are suttas that use militaristic language in the context of Buddhism. Like there's the famous sutta in the Sutta Nipata, where before the Buddha becomes enlightened, Mara is trying to talk him out of striving for enlightenment. And the Buddha says, for example, it is better to die in battle than to live in defeat, which is like militaristic language. Also, there's the Pasura Sutta of the Atthakavagga, which has a lot of militaristic language in it. But in a way, it's kind of making fun of this man named Pasura who's always wanting to debate people. So in this case, debate is seen as a kind of like aggression. If you're just trying to pin people down and like rub their nose in their own faulty reasoning and like pick faults, you're sort of finding flaws in their arguments and so forth. That was seen as a kind of aggression. So, I mean, that's militaristic language in the context of Buddhism, but in a kind of derogatory sense. But, I mean, there is occasionally some militaristic language that's in a positive sense. It's like, there's the verse in the Dhammapada, better than, defeating 1,000 times 1,000 enemies in battle is defeating your own, sort of like conquering your own self, that kind of thing. But using militaristic language, which personifies the kilesas as enemies to be fought, that's really not a good way of going about it. It might be okay, like at a kind of elementary level, but trying to use like Khmer Rouge tactics against your own defilements is, I mean, you're just setting yourself up for just like frustration and hysteria and misery, because it really doesn't work that way. In a way, you have to transcend the kilesas by making peace with them, which may sound like very undharmic, but still, I mean, it's just being mindful of the kilesas. I mean, that's the best way to like overcome your defilements is through like the radical mindfulness. So like some kind of like anger or hatred, some kind of defilement arises, note it, let it go. Choiceless awareness. You're not struggling against it. You're not fighting against it. You're not seeing it as the enemy, because that just intensifies the struggle and just keeps you enmeshed in samsara. I mean, any kind of struggle really is going to be of limited value, because you're making a big deal of it and you're just sort of intensifying the karma. You're reinforcing it by struggling against it. Which reminds me of a saying of the multi-dimensional entity called Seth, allegedly channeled through a woman named Jane Roberts back in the 1970s, where he said, you're not going to, you're not going to end war by hating war. You're going to end war by loving peace. And it's kind of the same way. You're not going to overcome your kilesas by hating your kilesas. You're not going to overcome your defilements by hating your defilements and struggling against them as some kind of enemy, trying to eradicate them the way the Khmer Rouge was eradicating like potential enemies of the state. I mean, you have to make peace with it, and it's sort of like Gandhian peaceful non-cooperation. But being against something is just intensifying the problem, is just reinforcing the problem. And like Paul Lowe used to say, don't be against anything. And if againstness arises, don't even be against your own againstness. So I guess I answered that one. Time to move on to Xenothoid's next question. And he says, assuming you have read The Art of War, is there anything from that book that might aid a Buddhist in fighting their kilesas, or is it really only applicable to literal physical warfare? No, it's not just applicable to literal physical warfare. Like a lot of cutthroat, like economic sharks, like businessmen, corporate businessmen, they would use like Musashi's The Book of Five Rings and Sun Tzu's The Art of War as a way of helping them in business, cutthroat business. It's sort of economic warfare. But I got a book on the bookshelf. It's an excellent book. It's the Strategy, The Indirect Approach by B.F. Little Hart. And he starts off, like the frontispiece, he's quoting Sun Tzu. And some of the statements he's quoting from Sun Tzu is with regard to the indirect approach. That, the worst thing you want to do is just, like for a general, is just an all-out frontal attack. That's like the stupidest kind of warfare, is just a frontal assault. What you want to do is use your strength to attack weakness. You use your strength to attack places that are undefended, or just like the weak points in the enemy, or you just try to weaken the enemy and make them unready to fight before you attack, this kind of thing. And that can be applied even in Buddhism towards your own defilements. A full-on frontal attack against your defilements isn't going to work nearly as well as just sort of like starving your defilements, cutting off your defilements' supply lines, demoralizing your defilements before you even really try to eradicate them, anything like that. Also in B.F. Little Hart's introduction, he's talking about how strategy really does not apply only to military or even political things. It's like even like a religious prophet. It's the duty, or it's like the job of the religious prophet to just be flat out direct and then get martyred. And then you've got like a more diplomatic person afterwards who uses the teachings of that prophet in a more subtle, indirect, diplomatic way to actually spread the word. Or just using the indirect approach, like trying to get your way with somebody, trying to get somebody to do what you want, is you just sort of subtly, indirectly feed them the idea and let them think that it's their own idea. And then it's more likely that you're going to get your way. That kind of thing. So let's see here. Did I answer the question yet? Is there anything from that book that might aid a Buddhist in fighting their kilesas? Yeah, you don't want to fight the kilesas though. You want to maybe overcome them or transcend them. But again, it's more like peaceful non-cooperation rather than just like all-out attack. Also, it just reminds me, one of the things about Sun Tzu's The Art of War, he's got a chapter on spies. And he says the best spies are people that look way dumber than they are. A person who looks dumb but is really clever makes the best spy. Someone who doesn't stand out, they just kind of look like a potato, but really they're brilliant. Those are the best spies, not like James Bond types that are going to stand out in a crowd because they're so ruggedly handsome or whatever. You want someone who looks like a truck driver or like a mill worker or something, who nevertheless is brilliant. Those are the best spies. And of course they have to be like fearless and all that too. But I only mention that because it's one of the few specific things I remember from reading The Art of War well over 10 years ago. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from PSA. Again, unlike most Q&As, I've got the same person like answered twice, because the first time it was in the previous Q&A, and then the second time is in this particular Q&A. We're up to 153 now, which is not prime. Remember that. It's important. You ought to be writing this down. So PSA says, can you talk more about your romance with fake Tig? And there's really not much to say. It's not exactly a romance, at least not at my end. It's just that there was this person claiming to be Ethiopian who spoke perfect English with like an American accent. And he sort of joined the Discord server right after this person named Tig, who was like this chronic, like trolling smartass got kicked off the server. And so a lot of people just thought that this person was really Tig in disguise, trolling us again by infiltrating the server as an Ethiopian who just happens to speak perfect English with no hint of any Ethiopian accent whatsoever. And so we had a vote, and more people were inclined to believe that it was Tig than that he wasn't, and so he get kicked off the server. But he obviously wants to come back. But there was like two things that really were strikes against him. One was he was meowing a lot. You know, he keeps typing meow, meow, and I mean it's just kind of something that like an adult male is. It's sort of like making bird calls. It's even worse than making bird calls. It just sort of demeans a man's dignity to do that. And it kind of like furry-ish. I don't know if they have furries in Ethiopia, but that's just kind of like furry adjacent when a guy is meowing a lot. And also he's talking about like loving me and this kind of stuff, which is kind of homo adjacent also. And so those were like two main strikes against him. He's stopped meowing. He hasn't meowed recently, but still he seems to be burning the torch for me or something. And I don't know, it's just, I don't know, it just does not seem entirely appropriate. So, our romance, such as it ever was, is pretty much non-existent, at least at my end. So I'm moving on to PSA's next question, which is, what do you think of the reliable and trustworthy DOJ and FBI stating that there was no Epstein list and that he actually self-deleted? Don't you just love the government? I feel so happy and safe living under their management. Well, there's actually 2 points here. There's the client list and the self-deletion. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that Epstein really did self-delete. But, I mean, it could be that he was persuaded to fall on his sword, so to speak. You know, it's like they turn off, or like they got rid of the cellmates and everything just to allow him to do that. Because, you know, it's like, if you don't, you're going to regret it. That kind of thing. So I'm willing to be open-minded. Maybe he wasn't offed. Maybe he was just pressured into self-deletion. So, I mean, he may have done it under duress or something, but, you know, that particular situation is, you know, I'm willing to be open-minded. So, like Dan Bongino and so forth, just saying, he did it. So, I mean, Dan Bongino, seems to be a straight shooter, as a general rule. But then getting to the client list, I mean, obviously, I mean, I remember when this whole thing first came down, there was repeated mention of like a video library being seized from one of his properties in New York. And whatever happened to that? It just poofed out of existence, didn't it? So Epstein, with regard to client lists and so forth, and the government saying, no, there wasn't a client list, even after like Pam Bondi was saying it was on her desk, and that she'd seen so many videos that were totally disgusting and everything, that, I mean, I don't think there's any intelligent, sane person out there who doubts that there were like very rich people hanging out with Epstein and messing around with underage girls. You know, it's like P. Diddy, you know, his freakouts, that kind of stuff. That, I mean, it happened. So, with regard to the government denying it, it seems like there's two possibilities that, for me, seem plausible. One is that you have so many of the most powerful people in America were involved that it would just be like nuking the whole power structure of America. I mean, it would be seen as just way too much trouble than it's worth. I mean, let's just say that there's nothing to it, even though nobody's going to believe us. So, I mean, it could be that there were so many people involved that were at the top that is just, we just gotta not say anything, just nope. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is that Epstein really was working for certain intelligence agencies. He was sort of helping them with regard to potential blackmail, including the intelligence agency of our greatest ally, which is a small country in Western Asia. And it could be that that small country in Western Asia has made it clear that, if you make us look this bad, potentially destroying like the relationship with America, that, we're gonna retaliate. And it's the custom of this West Asian small country that if somebody hits them, they hit back 10 times as hard. It's just like national policy for them. And so that one also is like, well, best thing to do to avoid just a complete shit hitting the fan scenario on a biblical scale, that we're just going to have to obviously lie and say, nothing to see here, folks. Let's just move on and kick out illegal aliens or something. And of course, our own intelligence agencies may have been involved. It seems to be, there is evidence that Epstein was communicating with the CIA. And so the two scenarios that I mentioned that seem plausible to me, they could overlap. Both could be applicable here. Now, a lot of people are saying, well, Trump had to be involved, otherwise he would just expose everything. But even if Trump wasn't involved, if Trump was involved, you'd think that over the years the Democrats would have said something. Would have like the Democrats who are like in control would have at least released that amount of Epstein files, but they didn't. But even if Trump isn't involved, I'd like to think that he wasn't. I don't know. He used to be friends with Epstein. The friendship ended pretty quickly, but still he was friends with him for a while. That, so many of Trump's friends, so many like really powerful, important people would be involved, that it's just opening a gigantic can of worms. And so it's just, no, we're just going to have to, let's just open the files in 2080, sort of like the Kennedy assassination, like information was like postponed until everyone involved was dead. So it could be another Kennedy assassination sort of thing. So, yeah, government has always been this way. You read ancient history, and ancient governments in many cases were much worse. When you've got like a sociopathic autocrat who can do anything he wants, then things are much worse than they are in America. But it is fairly clear that Epstein did have a lot of rich, powerful associates, acquaintances who essentially committed statutory word you can't say on YouTube. That they were messing around with what used to be called jailbait. No jail for them, though, because they're above the law, essentially, as elites generally are. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is kind of an interesting one from PSA. What do you think about tardigrades? They appear to be extraterrestrial organisms that can be boiled, frozen, even left in the vacuum of space, and they survive. Where do you think they could be categorized under Buddhist cosmology? Well, tardigrade is also called a water bear. It's a small invertebrate with 6 legs, I think, but they're not an insect. They don't have, they look like this roly-poly little animal, kind of like a bear. They're kind of bear-shaped, except with 6 legs and tiny. And they're an invertebrate. So I've always wanted to see one. That I did a study on myofauna as a college student, hoping to see tardigrades. Never saw tardigrades. I saw gastrotrix and chinorynchs. Didn't see any tardigrades. And the tardigrade has its own phylum. This is something that maybe people who aren't familiar with taxonomy wouldn't understand, but it's like the phylum is one of the biggest groups of organisms. At the top, you've got the kingdom. So you've got the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, the fungus kingdom. Then you've got like the protozoan, the protist kingdom. You've got the bacterial kingdom and the archibacterial kingdom. Those are the main kingdoms of life, at least when I was in college. So below that is the phylum. Like, for example, we humans are chordates. We belong to the phylum Chordata. For botanists, for plants, it's called a division. In zoology, it's a phylum. So you got mollusks are a phylum, annelids are a phylum, arthropods are a phylum, chordates, which includes all vertebrates, are a phylum. And then you've got some obscure little phyla. Or you got like porifera, the sponges, this kind of thing. There's lots of phyla. And then there's some obscure ones like gastrotrix, chinorynchs, and tardigrades. Tardigrades have their own phylum. And they're kind of unusual animals. Not only are they interstitial, which means that they're so small they live in between grains of coarse sand in the substrate of the ocean, or fresh water too, I suppose. They also live on moss. That tardigrades have like a symbiosis going with moss, some species, and so they can completely dehydrate. Like when the moss dries out, the tardigrade completely dries out, and then they just go into a state of suspended animation until they rehydrate. It rains or whatever. They come back to life. So that's pretty much what I think about them. I think they're really interesting, and I'd love to see a tardigrade face to face, but it's unlikely that I will because I don't own a microscope now. They're very tiny. So with regard to where do I think they could be categorized under the Buddhist cosmology? Animals. They're animals. They're tiricana, or as the Burmese would call them, tresan. And I mean, genetically, they're related to other terrestrial life. You know, probably genetically, they're 25% identical to a human. I mean, probably more than 25% because we're like something like 20% identical to bacteria. Just the genetic code, just like the biochemistry of life on Earth is pretty similar throughout all living things. You know, it's just the way it evolved on this planet, the genetic code, you know, the proteins and everything, just the way respiration works, you know, just the biochemistry of life is very similar throughout the whole living world on this planet. And if they really did come from outer space and just evolved separately from us, you'd think there'd be a way bigger difference between us. Like some of the biochemistry would be radically different. So what do I think about tardigrades? They're fascinating little animals. And where do I think they would be categorized under Buddhist cosmology? Animals. So I'm moving on to the next question. This is from Romeo. And Romeo says, what is your knowledge and opinion of the type of deism that many of the U.S. founding fathers favored? And I'm just making sure we are recording and that my microphone is still working. Is this working? Is it work? I should really be doing that this time after last time. So I'm not really an expert on deism. My understanding of deism as opposed to theism is that deists believe God created the world, God created the cosmos, including like the laws of physics, and just kind of set it going as like a clock. Just sort of, it's sort of self-maintaining afterwards, and then he just steps back and he doesn't intervene. I think that is what Romeo here is referring to as deism. That God created the world miraculously and then just kind of stepped back and no longer intervenes, or does so very rarely. You know, he's not controlling the weather, anything like that, possibly not even answering prayers. He just created this world as a kind of machine, or this universe, and then he just kind of sitting back and watching things happen. So that's my knowledge of it. I could be completely wrong. I could be confusing that with something else, but that's my educated guess, I suppose. And what is my opinion of that type of deism? It was kind of a modern approach to an attempt to reconcile the existence of God with science. That, both can be true if you just admit that, God created the cosmos and then just kind of let it run itself and just step back and is no longer intimately involved with the goings on this planet. He's aware of what's going on, but he's not intervening much, if at all. So my opinion of it, I don't really follow that approach. It's kind of a step towards the kind of theism that you would find like in Vedanta, where there is like a capital G God, but the capital G God doesn't have any like favorites or desires, any intentions really, just all is permitted. But I do think that deism, like early modern or mid-modern deism, like 18th century deism was, it had a bad rep. There, a lot of people would just be like it would be like a slur calling someone a deist. You're trying to denounce them by calling them that. But I think it was an attempt to reconcile this growing body of scientific knowledge with like traditional Christian belief in God. That, okay, look, everything seems to be following rules that are increasingly being understood by scientists, or at least observed and turned into mathematical models and so forth. And so, well, all right, so maybe there's no miracles now. It's just science is describing what God set up for this universe, that kind of thing. So it's understandable. I'm not a deist, but I can kind of understand how people would come to that conclusion, especially after science was gaining ground and standard Christian explanations for the world were losing ground, starting with Galileo or before Galileo. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Yosh Bui. Is that how you say the name? Yosh Bui? And he says, what is the nature of your ... thoughts with regards to game theory? And I know very little about game theory. I've never studied up on game theory. I was never particularly interested in game theory. I wasn't interested enough to actually study it enough to know what game theory is all about. It's some way of working out odds or likelihoods, sometimes or presumably based on human motives and so forth. But really, I am no authority at all on game theory. I'm not fully persuaded of what it is. And I wasn't even inspired to look up the meaning of game theory like I was with regard to the no true Scotsman fallacy. So, sorry, Yosh Bui. No idea on that one. And I'm just moving on to the next question. And this is from Siddhartha Lohachita. And Siddhartha Lohachita says, don't you think that the rise of Indian philosophies in the West, such as Buddhism or Advaita Vedanta, could lead to a sort of Indianization of the West or third worldification of the West? And then he continues, for example, ever since the time of the British Empire, it was Indian laborers brought by the British as near slave immigrants who built the railway from Egypt to South Africa up to the present day, with Elon Musk calling for more and more immigrants from India. Every year, around 2 million Indians emigrate, mainly to Europe or North America. So that's just a little bit of commentary there at the end. The question is here at the top. Don't you think that the rise of Indian philosophies in the West, such as Buddhism or Advaita Vedanta, could lead to a sort of Indianization of the West or third worldification of the West? Well, one thing you got to bear in mind was that India, at the time that Buddhism arose and Vedanta arose, was not really a third world country. India, in the Buddhist time, was pretty much the zenith of civilization, in my opinion. In some respects, world civilization has been going downhill since the time of the Buddha, in certain respects, not in all respects. We don't have grisly public executions anymore, for example. We don't have the rise of sociopathic autocrats, at least not yet. So, I mean, India in the Buddhist time, or at the time of Shankara, was very different from India now, partly because you had the Indo-Aryans, the invaders who set up the caste system, and they were the upper castes, and the dark-skinned, smaller, the Dasyus, they were like the Shudras and the outcasts at the time. It was almost sort of European in a sense, and some of the aspects, like in the Buddhist time, you had like oligarchic republics and so forth, pretty much like was going on in Greece around the same time. And the religion was similar to Greece. I mean, the culture was similar to Greece. And like when, for example, like Alexander the Great, I mean, he had a hard time defeating Indians, like King Porus at the Indus River. It took some doing to defeat Porus, and Alexander treated him with great respect even after he lost, just because he respected what a good general he was and like the level of civilization and so forth. Then after Alexander's time, you had like the Ptolemaic Empire, of which extended from Western Asia to the borders of India at first. And I mean, the Indians were able to defeat the Greeks in battle at the time. So, I mean, they were a world power pretty much. The Mauryan Empire, it didn't last very long, but it was a powerful nation. It could defeat the Greeks, at least sometimes. So, I mean, it was sort of like a rising, flowering kind of vibrant civilization at the time. And then gradually, after being like conquered over and over again by various invaders, and then just sort of the interbreeding of the Indo-Aryans with the Aboriginal peoples there, and just producing just sort of like this brown-skinned, almost uniform population that not as much diversity, I suppose, that India has declined. But I mean, you read something like, there's a book by a man named Basham, the wonder that was India. I mean, India in ancient times, it was really an advanced civilization, relatively speaking. So the rise of Indian philosophies in the West, such as Buddhism or Advaita Vedanta, I mean, those were products of India at its peak. So, yeah, I don't think that Buddhism or Advaita Vedanta being introduced into Western philosophies, into Western culture, is going to have a bad effect necessarily. In fact, it seems to be positive. Like Buddhism coming into the West, I mean, the people of the West are just like distorting it, watering it down, kind of perverting it to some degree. But still, I mean, it's the West that's fucking up Buddhism, not Buddhism that's fucking up the West. So, yeah, I don't think that's likely to happen. Certain other aspects of modern Indian culture, like the nepotism that you hear so much about, that kind of thing could have an adverse effect on Western culture. But, yeah, I don't think that Buddhism or Advaita Vedanta are going to have an adverse effect on Western culture. So I'm just going to move on to Siddhartha Lohachita's next question. Why do you think the average Indian worker, I think it's supposed to be is so submissive and without any desire to struggle for rights and dignity or freedom, like the Mexicans or South Americans in general? They don't comply, just obey, or it says they don't complain. So does that mean they don't complain? Maybe that means they don't complain, just obey. For that, many companies, from tech firms to construction ones, are fighting over them. I've never heard of an Indian, immigrant working in a construction company. In fact, I mean, I've been working like in sheet metal shops and trucking, now a trucking company. I mean, you just almost never see Asians, and then even as customers. Whether it's West Asians, South Asians, East Asians, they're just not really that involved. It's pretty rare, like to have like an East Asian customer at a sheet metal shop. I mean, that's remarkable. And so the guys in the shop would be like mentioning it to each other. Well, you see that guy? He looked Japanese or something. But let's see here. Why do I think the average Indian worker is so submissive and without any desire to struggle for rights and dignity or freedom? I'm really not that acquainted with Indian workers other than occasional telemarketers, or you call for assistance with regard to something and you're talking to somebody in Mumbai, that kind of thing. But I don't really have a lot of experience with Indian workers. I've heard that, I mean, one thing about Indian workers is that you get one Indian in charge, he'll just fire all the non-Indians and just hire Indians. I've heard that rumor before, more than once. So, I mean, that was not entirely submissive. You know, it may be that Indian culture is sort of like Burmese culture, where you just kiss the ass of superiors. You can be haughty and tyrannical towards inferiors, but the people above you, you're just obsequious as hell. You just kiss their ass. So, I mean, that could be a certain kind of Asian traditional thing. But once you have an Indian in charge, he's not going to be that meek and mild anymore necessarily. So let's see here. Yeah, that would be like my explanation. I guess that's like my guess at an answer on that one. And I have to be concise because we're already 2.5 hours into this. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Gnostic Rocker, or Gnostic Rocker. And he says, do you think the process of gaining wisdom is a kind of instantaneous process, a flash of wisdom, if you like, or is it a slow, incremental process, a kind of piecing together in a jigsaw-like fashion, a testing of theory to see how it stands up to the light of day-to-day life? Perhaps it's a mix of both. What is your experience in that process? The gaining of wisdom, it seems mainly gradual. I mean, if you become enlightened, then that would be a quantum leap. You know, it'd just be an infinite jump from unenlightened to enlightened. But you can still have, I mean, the veil gets like thinner and thinner, but still ultimately from unenlightened to enlightened would seem to be a quantum leap. But with regard to gaining wisdom in general, I mean, going with Buddhism or Hinduism, any system that believes in rebirth and a kind of spiritual evolution, then it's going to be gradual over many, 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 many lifetimes. Like Ram Dass, who speaks mainly from a Hindu perspective, talks about how like the evolution of wisdom in an individual, or like, you know, a reborn stream of individuals it's like a clock. You start at midnight, you know, and just 1 minute past midnight, that's like the beginning of a new karmic stream. And it's getting farther and farther away from the absolute at 12. You know, it's getting farther and farther away, just deeper and deeper into samsara as consciousness develops, but wisdom, you know, the wisdom, it really isn't keeping up with the cognitive development, so that like you getting into animal realms and so forth, that they're just getting deeper and deeper enmeshed in samsaric quasi-reality or pseudo-reality until you get to 6. And then once you get to 6 and start going back up towards 12, then gradually the wisdom is catching up again, and you're actually getting closer and closer to realization of the absolute again. So, I mean, in that sense, obviously, it's extremely gradual, possibly lasting millennia. And so it's not going to happen all at once. I mean, sometimes you do have a flash of insight. You know, it's just all of a sudden something clicks You have this aha moment sort of thing. That happens sometimes. That can be triggered through meditative insight. Just meditation can help that along. But sometimes it's just sort of a gradual thing you have to learn. Like there's a wise monk in Burma, I don't know if he's still alive, Mahamyain Uzodika, who says, there's some things you can only learn when you're old. That kind of thing. So that would be a kind of wisdom that's gradual, and it's more of the second kind that Gnostic Rocker's talking about here, like the slow incremental process. But it could be a slow incremental process of little like flashes that still are, it's like an instantaneous increment kind of a thing. It can happen that way too. But gradually, it's like the veil, the samsara just kind of gets weaker and weaker, which is a gradual process. So, that can happen too. So yeah, it's, let's see, it's a mix of both, I would say. And so I'm just going to move on to Gnostic Rocker's second question, which is, which Hindu texts move you? Although the philosophical terminology on the surface of things is utterly at odds, for example, the infinite unique self merging with the Godhead of Hinduism in contrast with the eternal no-self of Buddhism disappearing or vanishing into Nibbana, I was or am profoundly affected and moved by Ashtavakra Gita, Viveka Chundamani, and the Avaduta Gita. What are about your own experience with a variety of Hindu texts? Well, I've never read the Ashtavakra Gita, never heard of the Viveka Chundamani, and never heard of the Avaduta Gita. I'm completely unfamiliar with any of these texts that Gnostic Rocker has mentioned, partly just because my exposure to Hindu scriptures is limited to the main, most popular ones. Like, I've read the Bhagavad Gita more than once. And I've read all of the main Upanishads. I've read like excerpts from the Rig Veda, for example. And those would be pretty much the only like scriptures that move me. Bhagavad Gita is profound. The principal Upanishads, for the most part, have a lot of profundity in them. And aside from that, then it would be like modern stuff, like Miracle of Love, stories about Neem Karoli Baba, that kind of thing. That's probably the most moving. That book, compiled by Ram Dass about Neem Karoli Baba, that's the one Hindu text, not scripture. It's like a mass market paperback, but that one I have found the most moving from a Hindu point of view. A lot of Ram Dass's stuff that he wrote way back in the day, back in the 1970s, that's moving, because it's like he's talking about his first-hand experiences, and he was moved by it, and you can't help but, he's like a good teacher who's really enthusiastic about what he's teaching, and so you can't help but catch some of that enthusiasm if you're in tune with what he's saying. But with regard to like scripture, I guess it would just be the Bhagavad Gita and some of the principal Upanishads. So let's see here. And with regard to, the surface of things, the terminology on the surface, it's at odds, but the highest truth, the name that can be named is not the eternal name. So you're going to have to come up with some way of explaining what can't be explained, just as almost like a necessary evil or something. So it shouldn't be too surprising that different spiritual movements, different spiritual systems may disagree with each other, even though the highest attainments are pretty much, you can tell that they're trying to describe the same essential attainments. Like the Upanishads are trying to explain the same thing as some of the Buddhist metaphysical texts or mystical texts. And it's just the starting samsaric assumptions differ. And so they have to use different language. Or St. John of the Cross, from a 16th century Roman Catholic perspective, is describing a lot of the same very exalted meditative states as a Buddhist text is describing. But of course, he has to use 16th century Spanish cultural assumptions, which are, of course, going to wind up with very different ways of trying to explain things, even though the experience itself may be identical or close to identical. Still, it's just the cultural environment is going to cause different ways of explaining things. So I'm just going to move on to Gnostic Rocker's third question. And he says, it occurs to me more and more as time passes and as I meet more and more people that the vast majority of people just do not like or have no interest in philosophical questions, nor are they overly interested in other poetic literary approaches to wisdom and being in this body and mind in time. Within this experience, they'd rather be discussing movies, the life of the stars, a cliched political fake figure, or some TV or sporting sensation. Have you found that to be true as well? Yeah, I've found that to be true. I mean, most people, they're not into philosophy. Philosophy essentially involves tearing down common sense realism. Most people are living in a state of common sense realism. A chicken, a dog, they're living a sense of common sense realism. You just take everything at face value. It's all real. And most people are operating at that level. They might have a deep intuitive feeling that that's not enough, that that's not the whole story, but still the average person are just enmeshed in samsara. It might be that most of them haven't reached all the way to 6 o'clock yet. So, yeah, it's like philosophy threatens your view of reality if you're not philosophical. If you're just a common sense realist and just take everything at face value, that your car is ultimately real, money is ultimately real, houses, people, all ultimately real, then philosophy, which starts to question that, is like sort of undermining your world. It's like threatening your existence in this subtle, scary way. And I remember when I came back to America, I think it's from Burma the first time, this is back around 1997, it was like people that I'd be talking to, they almost never asked me what it was like living in Burma. They instead, have you seen this movie? This is a really good movie, or this is a great TV show that's on. And they'd just be wanting to go on and on about this movie that they really liked. And, I was a monk in robes, just come back from living in tropical Asia for X number of years, and it's like they weren't really interested. But then again, it's just sort of like alien to their world. They can't really relate to it. It's just something that they wouldn't even know what questions to ask, maybe in some cases. So yeah, but I did find that to be true as well. And I'm moving on to the next question. This is from Rui. And Rui says, did you ever hear of a Burmese lady renunciant called Ajahn Naeb? I think she lived sometime between the late 19th century and maybe the mid 20th century. Ajahn Naeb was a specialist in Abhidhamma and the teacher of my own Abhidhamma teacher in Bangkok, a most venerable Thai lady known as Ajahn Sujin. Saturday sessions with the Ajahn served to cover a lot of ground, and I am truly grateful to her for providing a no-holds-barred environment for Dhamma discussion. At the time, I was still leaning more towards Vajrayana, and interestingly, Abhidhamma helped me turn more to the suttas. So it's kind of weird. She's a Burmese nun, I suppose, or maybe a Burmese like 8-precept yogi. But Ajahn is not a Burmese word, and Naeb is not a Burmese name. So if there was a Burmese woman who moved to Thailand, Siam in those days, she changed her name. And I've never heard of her in Burma. I mean, she's not a thing in Burma. She may have been born in Burma, but apparently she adopted a Thai name and was like a Thai citizen or subject, an inhabitant of Thailand, and was not a thing at all in Burma. So yeah, I've never heard of her before. But it is true that the Burmese are like the Abhidhamma scholars par excellence. So that part rings true. I'm not doubting that there was a Burmese woman who renounced the world. Maybe she was even ordained or became like a 8 precept or 10 precept nun in Thailand, and nobody had ever heard of her in Burma. I don't know. I never heard of her. I've never heard her mentioned. Probably most Burmese people have never heard of her. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And I think we actually are kind of getting somewhere near the bottom of this scroll, this immense scroll of more than 60 questions. So this is from Dhamma River. And Dhamma River says, have you ever gone on a pilgrimage to the 4 holy sites, Lumbini, Bodh Gaya, Sarnath, and Kushinagar? How was it? If you haven't been to all 4, have you visited any of them? How was that experience? And I seem to see that there are 4 question marks here. So let's see, first sub question. Have you ever gone on a pilgrimage to the 4 holy sites? Yeah, before I went to Burma, I was a monk ordained at a Burmese monastery in California, Tampulu Kaba'a Monastery in Boulder Creek, California. And then I was really like disillusioned and dissatisfied with the Dhamma scene there. And so when one of the senior Sayadaws in the Tampulu tradition, he was called Pakoku Sayadaw, although he also went by the name of Tampulu Chaltsin Doya Sayadaw. He came to America. I wanted to go back to Burma with him. And some of the senior monks at the monastery in California advised me that the shit was hitting the fan in California, which is often the way it is in Western Dharma scenes, especially maybe California ones. You know, it's like the board of directors were located in San Francisco, and it was just all kinds of chaos erupting at that monastery. The Burmese supporters were in open revolt against the board of directors and trying to take over the monastery without realizing that you can't just take over property from like the legal deed owner of the property, that kind of thing. It was like the classic textbook case of schizophrenia in a German nun that was there who was making trouble, and just all kinds of problems there. And so I went back to Burma with Pakoku Sayadaw. And on the way to Burma, before we got to Burma, we spent a week or 2 in Japan. And then we spent like 10 days in Thailand. And then we spent like 3 weeks in India. And we went on the pilgrimage there. And then went back to Thailand for another 10 days. And then finally went to Burma. And we went to 3 of the 4 holy sites because Pakoku Sayadaw didn't want to go to Lumbini, which is in Nepal, because he tried to go there before, and for some reason they would not grant him entry into Nepal, that it was some kind of visa hassle he was having. And so he was anticipating that might happen again. And so we went to Bodh Gaya, Sarnath, and Kushinagar, plus we went to a bunch of other places. You know, we went to the ruins of Nalanda University and Waisali, and we went to Savatthi, you know, and went to the famous monasteries that the Buddha stayed at. You know, the Jeta Grove, we went there. We went to the Bamboo Grove. We went to Vulture Peak. I looked for the Black Rock where Venerable Gautama became enlightened through self-termination, but I couldn't find it. That was right next to Rajgir, which used to be Rajagaha, near Vulture Peak, that sort of thing. So we went to a bunch of places, but we never went to Lumbini in Nepal because the Sayadaw who was leading the expedition wanted to avoid any potential like visa hassles that he had in the past. So how was it? It was fine. I mean, it was like Bodh Gaya was one of the first places we went to. And it was like, it's either going to be like this sacred place that's just glowing with spirituality, or it's just going to be like this old temple made of rocks. And it kind of was both at the same time. I mean, the beggars there are just, I mean, they're really, it's sort of like gadflies or something. They just hound you relentlessly. A lot of places in Burma, or in India, there's just, you just get like harassed by beggars or just people wanting to get money out of you somehow or another. That was one reason why I couldn't find the black rock. I didn't want to ask anyone to help, because if they help, there's a good chance they're going to stick their hand out for payment after they help you. And being a monk, I didn't have any money. Being a strictly practicing monk, I didn't have any money. So Bodh Gaya was interesting. I mean, I went around to not just the Burmese place and the Bodh Gaya itself, the Bodhi tree. Went around to some of the other monasteries. The Bhutanese monastery really was one of the most impressive, just like with regard to the architecture and the decorations and so forth. Let's see. I went to, before we went to Sarnath, we stopped in Varanasi, where I went to the burning ghats. And that was impressive. Just seeing corpses burned. I mean, I'm not going to go into details. We just don't have time. But that was impressive. See what else? There was another one. One place we went to. Now I can't think of it. But, okay. So let's see. If I haven't been to all four, have you visited any of them? Yeah. And how was that experience? You get the condensed version. But yeah, I have been to 3 of them. The ones in India. There was one experience, I'll just throw it in as a total digression, even though we don't have time for it. That one time, all the other members of the expedition went to a restaurant, and being this hard-nosed monk, I didn't want to go into a restaurant. So I ate in this Matador minibus, where we were traveling in this Matador minibus, and there was a big fly, inside the minibus with me. I'm by myself eating my meal. Everyone else is at the restaurant. And I'm worried a little bit that this fly is just going to land right in my tea. You had this milky special tea stuff. Or maybe it was coffee. I don't remember now. It was good, and I wanted to drink it. And of course, the fly just landed right in it. And this was this was a place where that fly could have been anywhere. It could have been licking the sores of a leprous beggar right before landing in my coffee. But I wanted to drink that coffee so bad, I was willing to risk it. So I just got rid of the fly, flicked the fly out of the coffee and drank it anyway. It was, my greed overcame any kind of common sense, because that fly could have been anywhere, just feeding on diseased dung or something right outside the minibus for all I knew. I think that was some Vaisali. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. After that totally uncalled for digression. And this is from Mogambo. And Mogambo says, what are your thoughts on human biases? But that's not the whole question, because there's an essay here. Every person has their own beliefs and ideologies, and it infiltrates into their Dhamma. Like you have a right-wing bend, so you would think Buddhism of the left is not the right one, and vice versa. Someone on the left would think your Buddhism is not the right one. I personally believe there is no right view, but only rejection of all views. Right and wrong views are subjective, and a person cannot detach themselves from their culture and personal biases, including an enlightened being to some degree. While talking about Abhidhamma with Brian, you told you don't believe Abhidhamma doctrine is not the right one, but according to Burmese, it is so. At the end of the day, a person believes what he wants to according to their biases. If a woke person reads Buddhism, he will think Buddha is left-wing. If a red-pilled person reads it, he will think Buddha was a right-winger. How can one detach themselves from their innate nature and biases? Okay, well, first of all, I'm really not particularly right-wing. I mean, to the far left, anyone to the right of Karl Marx is just a fascist Nazi right-winger. So I've been accused of it many times. But if I take those political compass tests, I generally wind up pretty close to the middle. So I'm like a classical libertarian, something like that. But that's fascism from the point of view of a lot of people nowadays. So let's see, human biases. Right and wrong views are subjective, and a person cannot detach themselves from their culture and personal bias. Yet to some degree, even enlightened beings are just going to adopt for the sake of convenience, if nothing else, the assumptions of their culture, at least to a profound degree. So let's see. I guess the main question here is, how can one detach themselves from their innate nature and biases? Well, you do it mainly through mindfulness. I mean, it's to some degree, it's always going to be there. I mean, you're a product of your culture. Even if you detach from that, you detach from your personality, the personality is still going to be there, culturally conditioned. So, I mean, one thing you do is you leave society, which is where like the cultural conditioning took place. You leave society, go off alone into a cell or a forest or whatever. I mean, that helps to separate you from a lot of it. And you just don't get embroiled in politics and so forth. If you're a monk living in a forest, you just leave that behind. That gets rid of a lot of biases. You're still going to have biases, though. I mean, like certain foods you're going to like, certain foods you're going to dislike. You're going to dislike noise. You're going to not like the loudspeaker blasting in the distance at the local village, this kind of thing. You're still going to think like, I mean, if you're American, you're still going to think like an American. I mean, I was trying to be like an ancient Indian monk, but still, I mean, ancient Indian monks had no knowledge of Led Zeppelin or Gilligan's Island, which is stuff that's going on in my mind a lot. I mean, I don't obsess on Gilligan's Island, but still, you can use Gilligan's Island as a teaching tool, or you can just have in the background of your mind Led Zeppelin. I remember one time I woke up in a cave in Burma with 4 Sticks by Led Zeppelin just pounding away, and it was like when I woke up it was pounding, so that I got the distinct impression that it had been going since before I woke up. It was just there. 4 Sticks has really pounding drums in it. So let's see here. How can one detach themselves from their innate nature and biases? You have to do it through mindfulness. It's like in the seen, there's only the seen. In the heard, there's only the heard. In the felt, there's only the felt. In the mentally sensed, there is only the mentally sensed. So you just see it as, I mean, you don't identify with it. It's just mental states are arising. You get some food that you don't like in your bowl, or some lady pours soup right all over the cake that was already in your bowl. She's a great lady. You just poured soup all over my cake. But still, it's like, if you're being mindful, you just watch that thought arise, and it's not you. It's just the thought is arising. And if you master that, then it's like there's this person who's just going through the motions, this nature taking its course, while your mindfulness is just detached from that. It's still there. It's just you're detached from it. Like pain, for example, you can feel pain. You can detach from it. It's just a sensation that is arising. So the easy answer is mindfulness. And I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Red Snapper. And Red Snapper says, do you believe the Sea Peoples existed? And the Sea Peoples, for those of you who are not into ancient history, were a group of pretty much like seafaring pirates in the Eastern Mediterranean that helped to bring about the Bronze Age collapse, which was a massive collapse of civilization around the year 1200 BC. So like the Trojan War was probably an event in the Bronze Age collapse. That was the collapse of Troy. Was like, well, I guess the Iliad doesn't get to the end, but the Trojan War was like the process of Troy collapsing during the Bronze Age collapse. Greece collapsed. Most of the kingdoms and empires in the area collapsed. Egypt remained, but it shrank way down. The Hittites were, I mean, their empire died. A bunch of them just were wiped off the map, and you just had dark ages for centuries until finally Greece, for example, it started the archaic age, a few hundred years after the collapse. But do I believe the Sea Peoples existed? To the extent that I accept that people exist, then historically, yeah. I would believe that the sea peoples existed. I think the Greeks were some of the sea peoples. I think they were called the Ahiawa, which was, at least by the Egyptians in their inscriptions, in Egyptian inscriptions referred to the Greeks, the Mycenaean Greeks, as the Ahiawa, which is like a corruption of Achaeans. And then you had the Peliset, who were like the Philistines before they settled in what later became Philistia. They apparently came from from Crete. So, I mean, there were a number of these sea peoples that sometimes they would group together, form like a coalition to attack some place like Egypt. And sometimes they acted alone, I guess. And I guess what allowed the sea peoples to arise was the fall of the Minoan civilization. I have read that the Minoans had like a navy that protected the sea lanes and kind of kept law and order. They would, fight against pirates and so forth. And then when the Minoan civilization collapsed around like 1400 BC, then it just sort of left this power vacuum that allowed piracy to just run amok. And it wasn't just the sea peoples that caused the Bronze Age collapse. There was like long droughts causing just migrations of people desperate because the crops were failing in their own homeland. And then, the sea peoples were just resorting to just pillaging, preying upon other people to some degree. But yeah, I do think the sea peoples did exist. And I'm going to move on to Red Snapper's next question. And this one was under a video I did with Brian. He said, do you believe in the mantids? And like the mantids would be like an alien race that are very advanced. According to my friend Brian, I think the Greys are like servants or minions of the mantids. The mantids are just way more advanced than the Greys are. They're just pretty much advanced beyond human emotion and so forth, which is maybe one reason why they're seen as insectoid. But I am skeptical of the whole existence of mantids and Greys and so forth, except as a paranormal phenomenon. So I can accept that it's like this world is being generated by human consciousness. At least the human experience of it is being generated by human consciousness. And I do think that like UFOs, which are now called something else, and Greys and reptilians and so forth are just sort of paranormal phenomena that are kind of filtering through into our version of reality, but they're not something that can be like quantified and verified by science, like empirical science. It's just sort of, they're getting in through the cracks in the laws of physics and not really following completely the laws of physics that science has to use to verify things, so to speak. So, yeah, I mean, the universe is infinite, I assume, so that in an infinite universe, anything that's possible is, anything that can be imagined is possible, at least in a metaphysical sense. I got that from David Hume. That's almost an exact quote of David Hume. So if it's possible for there to be mantids, then somehow out there somewhere there's going to be mantids. But I think the ones involved in close encounters of the third kind and so forth are primarily a kind of paranormal event rather than space beings from other planets coming here to prepare us for membership in the Galactic Federation or whatever the hell the ufologists, many of them, are persuaded of. So I'm just going to move on to Red Snapper's third question. Is why did Jnanavira Thera, born Harold Edward Musson, I don't know how to pronounce that name. Why did Jnanavira Thera unalive himself? And I personally think Red Snapper already knows the answer to this question. He's just asking this question just so I'll say it publicly. Just going with the idea, he knows the lay name of Jnanavira. He knows who Jnanavira was, and he knows that Jnanavira self-deleted. He unalived himself. So in all likelihood, Red Snapper here already knows the answer to this question, but it's kind of a spicy, gossipy kind of reason. So he wants me to talk about it. Red Snapper. So Ñāṇavirāttara was an eccentric existentialist philosopher turned monk. He was friends with the first famous Ñāṇamoli. In fact, they were ordained together back around 1950 in what was then called Ceylon. And then Ñāṇavira he came to the conclusion that he had become an Arya. While he was doing walking meditation, just like philosophizing, and then something clicked. He thought that he had become a Sotapanna. And so he just sort of cut off Ñāṇamoli. They were no longer in a position of parity, as he put it. He was just too far above Ñāṇamoli for it to be worth his while to continue associating with him. And I mean, his interpretation of Dhamma is just hyper intellectual. It's like you wonder how a frog could possibly be unenlightened when the mechanics of unenlightenment are, like, even the subjective mechanics of it are so complicated that you'd have to be an intellectual to even understand the explanation. But anyways, around 1965, after he'd been a monk for 15 years and a Sotapanna for I don't remember how many years, he developed priapism. In other words, his ingazat remained in a kamaniyam state. Kamaniyam is Pali for an ingazat in this state, and it just means ready for action. So he had priapism, and he thought that it was a side effect of a medication that he took for dysentery. He had really bad dysentery, so much so that his intestines were scarred and he was in a state of chronic pain because of it. And so he thought that it was that this was a side effect of this dysentery medicine that he took, but in all likelihood, it was like a hysterical conversion reaction, that it was probably psychosomatic. And he found it so bothersome, so distracting, that he eventually euthanized himself with ether that he somehow got a hold of. Although probably the chronic pain from the dysentery scarring was also a factor, but he considered it to be mainly because of this kamaniyam ingazat problem that he was having. The angajata, I guess, would be Pali. Ingazat is the Burmese equivalent of angajata, where it's like it would be like the appendage of generation. Might be a good translation of that. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Mr. Pranav. And I'm just going to allow me a minute here. I want to scroll a little bit here. And yeah, we're getting close to the bottom. We're getting close to the bottom, you guys. Okay. Mr. Pranav. Yeah, we might be, this might not even set any records. It's gonna be close. We're gonna be like 3.5 hours for this one. But this is 1.5 videos. Mr. Pranav says, up until 19th century, child marriages were the norm all over the world. What were the reasons it stopped? Is it because of Industrial Revolution that a shift in general consciousness happened? I don't think so. I think child marriages were the norm all over the world, mainly, and I mean, that was just sort of the natural way of things. I mean, it was like that since ancient times. And then it stopped in modern times, not because of the Industrial Revolution, in my opinion, but because of feminism. You had like jealous women not liking that men were attracted to teenage girls. So I assume it's mainly due to like resentment and like bitter complaint from more or less feminist females in modern Western society that have caused a certain like opprobrium. Is that the correct pronunciation? Opprobrium? It's just sort of, it became like no longer politically correct to do that sort of thing. despite like Elvis and Jerry Lee Lewis and numerous other people well up into the 20th century. So let's see here. I guess the main reason why it stopped would be feminism and just women complaining about that sort of thing, because they just didn't like that men their age were attracted to women much younger than them, or girls much younger than them. So let's see here. Next question. Siovak and Sipad Zidana says, you have said you differentiate philosophy from religion via worship. However, in the Zen tradition, there is a saying where they say to kill the Buddha on the road, which means that you shouldn't rely on any external authorities to save you, including the Buddha himself. Would you say there is anything analogous to this in the Theravada tradition, or is worship entrenched in the Theravada tradition? Well, mainly I said the difference between philosophy and religion is that religion involves worship, whereas philosophy doesn't. If you add worship to philosophy, you get religion. So I did say that. So let's see here. In the Zen tradition, there is saying that when they say to kill the Buddha on the road, which means that you shouldn't rely on any external authorities to save you, including the Buddha himself. Would you say there is anything analogous to this in the Theravada tradition? Well, I mean, Siobhakshan Sipad Zina seems to be assuming that Buddhism is necessarily religion and not philosophy. But some schools of Buddhism would be more accurately described as philosophy than religion. The worshipy aspects of Buddhism would be more religious. But obviously the more philosophical, iconoclastic, non-devotional schools of Buddhism, like Madhyamaka, at least as represented in the Mula Madhyamaka Karaka, that would be more philosophy. So would I say there's anything analogous to this in the Theravada tradition? Well, the Atthakavaggas don't believe anything, have no view, no position. I mean, that's pretty good. I mean, that's kind of Zen-like. There have been some scholars who called the Atthakavagga proto-Madhyamaka, just because Madhyamaka seems to be like a logical justification for the position of the Atthakavagga. So, I mean, I'm not particularly religious. I'm more philosophical than religious. So for me, Buddhism is more a philosophy than a religion. I mean, there's obviously devotionalistic Buddhists who worship the Buddha as though he were God, or make up cosmic space Buddhas that they literally worship. So, I mean, Buddhism can be a philosophy or a religion or a combination of both. So, yeah, I mean, the Atthakavagga would be a good example of that. Or, I mean, there's like the famous statement of the Buddha gives some kind of discourse, and he asks Sariputta, do you believe what I just said? And Sariputta says, not yet. And then the Buddha praises him. Yeah, that's good. You don't just take whatever I'm saying and just believe it. So, I mean, there are statements along those lines you can find in the suttas. But, I mean, the Atthakavagga is pretty radical in that regard. It doesn't say kill the Buddha, but it does, say, don't hold any position, which is not particularly religious. So, I'm just going to move on to Siovakshya and Sipad Zidana's, let's see. Okay, Siovakshya and Sipad Zidana's second question. It says, when you say you define religion through worship, what do you mean exactly? For example, does it mean looking up to someone? Does it mean emulating them, as that can be seen as the highest form of worship? Or do you mean treating them like a monarch where you prostrate to the person? Because since the Buddha attained Parinibbana, he isn't going to listen to any person's prayers, and he isn't going to save you or help you in any way, as even when the Buddha was alive, he said that the Tathagatas can only show the way. So I'm curious what worship means in the Buddhist context, especially in Theravada. Well, I mean, I haven't, let's see, maybe I should just look up the word worship in the dictionary. Worship, no. I spelled it wrong. Worship. And then, okay. Noun, the feeling or expression of reverence and adoration for a deity. Or adoration or devotion comparable to religious homage shown towards a person or principle. That would kind of explain the worship of some Buddhists, where they revere Dhamma the way that some theists would revere a god. And then the other ones are archaic honor given to someone in recognition of their merit. We don't need to deal with that one. Okay, so worship is sort of like the belief in some superior being or superior principle in some cases, and just sort of like a reaction to that, I guess. Some sort of reaction to like a superior being, or the belief in a superior being. And I mean, if you consider the Buddha to be a superior being and you revere him, that could be considered worship. You know, just bowing in front of an altar to the Buddha would be worship. So, let's see. But still, not all Buddhists would be religious. And I'm not even referring to like the materialistic Buddhists of the West. Not that all Western Buddhists are materialists, but I mean, obviously a lot of Western Buddhists are like secular humanists with some Buddhist flavoring at it. So for them who don't bow to statues, that kind of thing, they might not be particularly religious either, but that's not the only non-religious Buddhists out there. So let's see. Reverence for what is considered to be a superior being. Although maybe someone who hates God, you know, so long as they still believe in God, then maybe that could be considered religious. But it's still the belief in a superior being. Let's see. He isn't going to save you. Yeah, let's see, where is it? Since the Buddha attained parinibbana, he isn't going to listen to any person's prayers. I've already mentioned in a previous Q&A, it was some time ago, that I used to know a village doctor near the monastery where I was staying in Burma. And he said that he prays to the Buddha. And I asked him, it's like the Buddha has attained parinibbana. He's no longer in samsara, according to Theravada. So how can you pray to him? And he's not going to hear he's not going to hear your prayers. And then this doctor explained to me that the Buddha could see into the future. And so in the past, he could look into the future and see this doctor praying to him. So that's just a little bit of an aside there. But let's see. Define religion through worship. Yeah, I mean, it'd be reverence to some being considered to be superior, which would apply to most Buddhists to some degree. I mean, if you consider the Buddha to be a man and you respect him, that's not necessarily religious. But when you're causing the Buddha to be like superhuman, you know, he's Udari Manusa, he's beyond mere human, then, I mean, that would be definitely, you got your foot in the door to religion. And then if you're like revering him in that context, bowing to his statues, praying to, making offerings, that kind of thing, then that would definitely be like full-blown religion. Let's see. So, I mean, that's close enough, I guess, to an answer. And really, we're well over 3 hours at this point. So I'm just going to move on to Seal of Action, Sipat Zidina's third question, which is, I've already pretty much answered this. Seal of Action, Sipat Zidina says, thoughts on Trump and his entire administration lying about the Epstein files. Well, I don't think his entire administration is lying. And to what extent they're lying, we can't really know, because we don't even know the truth. I do think that Epstein, I mean, he had clients. It may be that they destroyed the list and say there is no list, which wouldn't technically be lying because it no longer exists. But still, I mean, Epstein did have people coming to his place and fornicating with underage girls. I mean, that's almost certain. I mean, Prince Andrew has pretty much admitted to that. And there's pictures out there of, you know, these people like Prince Andrew, you know, consorting with underage girls. At least, you know, arms around them and this kind of thing. So, yeah, I've already answered the question in that, in all likelihood, telling the truth would just cause like this huge explosion of some sort or another. So I guess just refer to the answer that I already gave on this particular issue, and Siavakshan Sipat Zirna is just black-pilled in general. He's... Next question. This is from Liberating Insights. And Liberating Insights says, just a hypothetical question on the nature of consciousness. Does it still continue after the death of an arahant, or does it cease to exist? And again, the standard question of, like, what is it like to be fully enlightened? What are the mental states of a fully enlightened being? This kind of thing. What would the Buddha think about this? What would he say about that? So, the Buddha himself refused to answer questions like this. Like, does the Tathagata exist after death? The Buddha refused to answer. So, let's just say you've got infinite formless consciousness, but anything that's infinite and formless transcends duality. It has no way, you got no way of perceiving it. And so from a samsaric point of view, it just doesn't exist. Anything you say about it is going to be invalid. And if it exists in some non-samsaric way, some ultimate absolute way, you can't talk about it. You could say that it just transcends the duality of existence and non-existence, and that any individual person is partaking of like an infinitely small fraction of this infinite consciousness, infinite formless consciousness, which has to be everywhere, including inside us. So the human mind is just sort of taking that infinite consciousness and like complexifying and organizing it and utilizing it. But it is sort of like the quantum field in like theoretical physics. So yeah, consciousness isn't created or destroyed, going with that point of view, except for like Vijnana Khanda, which is consciousness that's being like complexified, organized, and utilized. That kind of consciousness. But Theravada Buddhism is not really good at explaining consciousness as consciousness. Mental states are one thing, but consciousness as consciousness, it seems to me that Theravada really can't explain it very well, which is kind of understandable. Because consciousness as consciousness is like the quantum field. So, yeah, consciousness in that sense, it just persists. It might stop being complexified in a certain way, turned into mental states, but still, it's like the quantum field, so to speak. At least that's one way of looking at it. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Jeffrey. And Jeffrey is the last questioner of this particular Q&A. And Jeffrey says, I have heard there is a sect of Hindus that believe the spirit does not take possession of the body until 100 days after birth. What are your thoughts on this? And I would be skeptical of an exact number of 100 days. Because, if it's a spirit, it's not even really going to be like bound to the same way of measuring time as we are. That time might, if it exists at all, might be very different for some karmic stream entering into a human body. The orthodox explanation of Theravada is that the karmic stream rebirth linking consciousness occurs at the moment of conception. So from a Theravada point of view, that abortion would necessarily be murder. But I don't think it necessarily works that way. I allow myself the liberty of being skeptical with regard to that. And I am reminded of something Ram Dass said in one of his early books about how some babies, they become like the karmic stream enters into them early on in the embryonic development, so that when they're born, they're just already completely like assimilated to being a baby. And so they're the babies that are crying and acting like babies, the stereotypical baby. But then Ram Dass also says that sometimes the karmic stream won't enter into the fetus until shortly before birth. And he says those babies are the ones that just seem like stoned out. They're just like staring in incomprehension because they haven't fully assimilated into being a baby yet. And so there might be some truth to that. I think that it's possible that the karmic stream, so to speak, can enter at different times. I mean, it can enter very early on, or it can enter late. And it may be that like some cases of sudden infant death syndrome are caused by, I mean, the baby was born, but there was no karmic stream that entered the baby at all. There was just nobody there. And so the body just stopped working and died because there was no consciousness animating it. So I think it is possible that the karmic stream doesn't necessarily enter a human being at the moment of conception, of the sperm fertilizing the egg. There has to be the karmic stream, the Gandhava, that enters right then. And then somehow you've got this complex human karma inhabiting a fertilized cell, a single fertilized cell. That, I mean, that's kind of hard for me to wrap my head around. I mean, it might be that the karmic stream just has like this little tendril attached to this fertilized egg, but still, I mean, it seems like that fertilized egg would be way too small to hold the complexity of a human being's karma. So, yeah, I think that it can vary. That's just my own guess, and it's certainly not what Orthodox Theravada teaches. But I don't think that 100 days would be more plausible than at the moment of conception. Especially, I mean, it couldn't be 99. It couldn't be 102 every once in a while. So, yeah, those are my thoughts on that. And I'm just going to move on to Jeffrey's second question, which is, do you face a certain direction while meditating, such as facing north? When I was a monk, I would just sit in whatever was the most convenient place. And so it could be facing in different directions. I think the Buddha was mainly, wasn't he facing east? I think facing east is considered to be the most auspicious direction. Or maybe his followers would face east and he'd be facing west, facing the Sangha. I can't remember now. Not that I don't think it's extremely important, but I do think that facing east is the most auspicious. You know, it's the direction of the rising sun and all that. And in Pali, you know, it's like east is the first direction mentioned. And it's like, in fact, it's even sometimes, I can't remember if this is Pali or, yeah, I think it's Pali, where east is like forwards, west is backwards, north is left, and south is right. That's how they measure it. So it was sort of like east, like on a map made in Western civilization, north is always up. But in India, it would be like east is always up in ancient India, if they made maps. But with regard to meditating, I don't do formal sitting practice anymore. But when I did, it was just, I would just sit in the whatever was the convenient direction. Like, for example, if when I was living at a certain monastery where I was living in a little room off the side of the congregation hall, then I'd either sit on my bed and meditate, in which case I was facing one direction, or I'd come out and sit in front of the altar, which would be in a different direction. So, I mean, if there's an altar and you're going to be sitting facing the altar, you just generally just whatever direction the altar is facing, you're going to be sitting in the opposite direction. So, yeah, it really was not important to me what direction I would sleep. Although they do have in Burma, there's like the auspicious side for, I would mention, like you got that little niche sticking out of a house where the altar is. I think that would generally be on the eastern wall. So you'd be facing east when you're meditating too. And I think with regard to sleeping, the Burmese have like traditional ideas. It's better to sleep with your head in a certain direction, but I don't remember which direction it is. So I'm just going to move on to Jeffrey's third question, which is the very last question of this extremely long Q&A. And he says, as I have heard, there has been $21 trillion spent on the war on poverty, and 70% has been spent on administration. Does this make bureaucratic social work wrong profession? Well, I assume by wrong profession he means wrong livelihood, and technically it would not be wrong livelihood. I mean, it's being a somewhat corrupt, somewhat incompetent bureaucrat, but wrong livelihood is mainly livelihood that is like selling weapons, selling animals for slaughter, selling slaves, selling poisons, that kind of thing is wrong livelihood. There's a standardized list. And being a bureaucrat that is working very inefficiently is not on that list. So technically, being like a borderline incompetent bureaucrat, or just a bureaucrat just enmeshed in this system that is just designed to be inefficient and squander money, which is, that's largely what the whole USAID thing was going on with Doge and all that a few months ago. It's still going on, just Elon Musk has separated himself from it. Yeah, it would not technically be wrong livelihood, but it depends on the mental states of the person doing it to determine whether or not it is like wholesome or unwholesome. A lot of the people involved in like corrupt bureaucracies, they have good intentions. It's just that their good intentions don't really manifest as good results very clearly. So, yeah, this is just the way big government tends to be this way. And so it's not wrong livelihood, but it depends on the individual's motives and their feelings and their mental states in general that determines whether what they're doing is bad or good or indifferent. And that's it. That's the end of this Q&A. And it's well after midnight. It's like 1 a.m. now. So if you got questions you think I can answer, no more than 3 per episode, please, then go ahead and ask those questions. Ask them their questions. And like and subscribe if you haven't already. And I'm out of here. You guys be happy or something, and I'm done.